Hey there, tonight, we're uncovering the most disturbing sexual practices of World War I, where the harsh reality is that behind the battle lines, intimacy took on forms that defy both our modern sensibilities and wartime myths. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. Amidst the chaos of World War I, when the world was otherwise occupied with the business of destruction, there was an industry that not only survived but thrived: wartime brothels. Now, put away any Casablanca-style fantasies of romantic trysts and seductive spies. The reality, my friends, was far less glamorous and a lot more transactional. We're talking about an industry that saw staggering numbers of soldiers seeking solace from the horrors of war, propelling local economies into overdrive. Let's start with some numbers that might surprise you or at least make you raise an eyebrow. In Paris alone, it's estimated that upwards of 40,000 women worked in these establishments. Yes, you heard right, 40,000. And these were the official figures, mind you. The unofficial numbers, well, that's a whole different story. The clientele. Soldiers, of course, from every corner of the Allied forces, marching in with their boots and leaving behind a trail of francs. To put things in perspective, a single soldier's visit could cost anywhere from 5 to 20 francs, depending on the menu of services. Multiply that by the thousands of daily visits, and you've got a booming business that was almost as essential to the war effort as ammunition. Now, let's debunk a popular myth that wartime brothels were places of romantic entanglement. Spoiler alert, they weren't. The romantic image is a product of post-war nostalgia, a narrative spun to mask the grim reality. These women, often referred to with euphemisms like fallen angels or ladies of the night, were more like cogs in a relentless machine. Their existence was anything but romantic. Most were driven to this line of work out of sheer desperation, their lives a testament to survival in a world gone mad. The role of governments in this sordid tale is not to be underestimated. They were not merely passive observers. Oh no, they were active participants. In fact, the French government, among others, saw these establishments as essential to the war effort. They were obsessed with maintaining order, because you know, in the middle of a war, someone had to keep a tight leash on. Moral values. Brothels were subjected to stringent regulations, including regular medical inspections, to prevent the spread of venereal diseases, which were as rampant as mustard gas in the trenches. Primary sources from the time, like letters and military reports, reveal a bizarre level of bureaucratic involvement. One military directive, dated 1917, outlines the specific hours of operation for these establishments, presumably to ensure soldiers return to the front lines on time. It's almost comical, almost like a school bell signaling the end of recess, except with far more dire consequences if you didn't show up for class. And let's not forget the economic impact. The influx of soldiers meant a boost in local economies that was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, businesses flourished, from local cafes to tailors who suddenly had more uniforms to patch up than they knew what to do with. On the other, this economic boom was built quite literally on the backs of women who were often exploited and trapped in a cycle of poverty and disease. To say the situation was complex would be an understatement. These brothels were a microcosm of wartime society, reflecting the broader inequalities and desperation of the era. They were a place where the personal and the political collided, where the grinding machinery of war met the human need for connection, however fleeting and transactional it might be. In the end, the story of wartime brothels during World War I is a vivid reminder of the lengths to which people will go to maintain a semblance of humanity in inhumane times. It's a tale of survival, exploitation, and the relentless march of economic forces that often care little for the individuals caught in their path. So, next time someone tries to romanticize the past, remember that behind every myth is a reality grounded in the gritty, often uncomfortable truths of history. And speaking of gritty, uncomfortable truths, let's dive into the wartime epidemic that was less flashy than a battlefield, but just as deadly. Sexually transmitted infections. Yes, our friends in khaki weren't just bringing home stories of valor and victory. They were also, quite literally, bringing something else back to the home front. We're talking about a surge in venereal diseases that would make even the most seasoned medic wince. First, let's get some numbers on the table because, as we know, data doesn't lie, though it might make you want to avert your eyes. During World War I, it's estimated that about 400,000 cases of SDIs were reported among the British troops alone. That's nearly the population of a bustling city at the time. And before you think this was just a British issue, the American Expeditionary Forces weren't far behind, with around 18,000 cases reported in 1918 alone. The French and Germans were similarly afflicted, making this one pandemic that cared little for national borders. Now, how did this happen? Well, the blame game was as international as the war itself. Some blamed the soldiers' lack of self-control, a classic case of blaming the victim, if you ask me. Others pointed fingers at the women, conveniently ignoring the fact that desperation doesn't exactly come with a health guarantee. And then there were those who shook their heads at the lack of proper prophylactics. Picture this. Soldiers were often issued prophylactic kits that included items like soap and antiseptic wipes. Not exactly the high-tech solutions of today, and certainly not foolproof. Ah, the prophylactic, a word that sounds as clinical as it is vital. During the war, military officials attempted to promote the use of condoms, but in practice, this was about as successful as trying to stop the rain with a paper umbrella. Many soldiers either didn't use them or used them improperly. Some even refused on moral grounds, arguing that it was better to risk disease than to be caught with such evidence of immoral behavior. And let's not even get started on the quality of these early condoms. Let's just say that modern latex owes a lot to the sweaty trial and error of the past. The public health response was a fascinating dance of moral outrage and military necessity. Governments were caught between a rock and a hard place. They needed to keep their troops healthy enough to fight, but the idea of openly supporting sexual activity was a PR nightmare. So, they did what any good bureaucrat would do. They launched campaigns that were equal parts education and shaming. Posters warned soldiers of the enemy within and urged them to avoid the so-called venereal peril. It was a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. But hey, subtlety was never a strong suit in wartime propaganda. And speaking of sledgehammers, let's talk about the treatments available for those unlucky enough to catch something. Before the advent of penicillin, treating syphilis involved mercury and arsenic-based compounds, because nothing says, get well soon, like a dose of poison. The side effects were as delightful as you'd imagine, ranging from hair loss to serious organ damage. For gonorrhea, the goiter was a painful urethral irrigation with silver nitrate, which sounds just as pleasant as it is. Despite the grim realities, the venereal disease scare did spark some positive changes. It led to increased funding for research and the eventual development of more effective treatments. In a way, it was a catalyst for the modern field of sexual health, a silver lining, if ever there was one. But at the time, it was just another layer of complexity in a war that seemed to specialize in them. The intersection of sex, disease, and war isn't exactly dinner table conversation, but it highlights something crucial: the messiness of human nature. In the midst of chaos, people sought connection, however fleeting, and the consequences were as unpredictable as they were inevitable. It's a testament to the fact that war, with its grand narratives of heroism and sacrifice, is built on the backs of very human stories. Stories that are often awkward, uncomfortable, and all too real. As we wrap up this chapter of our tale, we're left with a vivid reminder that history is never as simple as it seems. The myths may be romantic, but the reality is firmly grounded in the gritty details of life, love, and survival. Stay tuned, because there's more to unravel in this tangled web of history. It's a story that keeps on giving in all its flawed, fascinating glory. Now, speaking of tangled webs and all too human stories, let's shimmy over to one of the most tantalizing characters of World War I, Mata Hari. Yes, the name alone conjures images of veils, exotic dances, and a life filled with intrigue. But let's pull back the curtain on this legendary femme fatale and see what really lies beneath the sequins and smoke. Mata Hari, born Margaretha Zell in 1876 in Leeuwarden, Netherlands, was a woman who understood the power of reinvention long before Madonna made it a career. She transformed herself from a failed marriage and a lackluster existence into the most famous exotic dancer of her time. Her performances were hailed as scandalous and mesmerizing, the kind of spectacle that left audiences wondering how much was art and how much was, let's say, revealing. Now, it's no surprise that her allure caught the eye of military intelligence, and she was soon embroiled in the world of espionage. The narrative, romanticized by countless films and novels, suggests she was a master spy, a double agent slipping secrets between the sheets. But let's hold the applause for a moment. The reality is a little less James Bond and a little more, oops, I did it again. Here's a fun fact. Despite her reputation, Mata Hari was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine when it came to actual espionage. In fact, historians now argue that her intelligence was often either irrelevant or already known to her handlers. Her glamour and mystique turned out to be far more effective than any coded message. Ironically, it was her fame, her very brand of seduction, that made her a convenient scapegoat when things went south for the French in 1917. Accused of being a German spy, she was arrested, and in a trial that was more theater than justice, condemned to death. Her execution by firing squad was the dramatic final act of a life that, while fascinating, was far from the espionage epic it's often made out to be. The French government, desperate for a scapegoat amid a morale crisis, found an easy target in a woman whose greatest crime may have been living life a little too large for comfort. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the irony. Mata Hari, the so-called spy, was less a mastermind and more a tragic victim of her own myth. She was a product of a world that both created and destroyed her, a figure who highlights the absurd lengths to which governments went in the name of national security. Her story is a reminder that the line between fact and fiction in wartime is often as thin as the silk she wore on stage. But Mata Hari wasn't alone in this odd intersection of seduction and espionage. The Great War saw governments deploying sexual intrigue as a tool, albeit a blunt one, in their intelligence arsenals. The British, French, and Germans were all guilty of this tactic, often with results that ranged from the mildly successful to the downright laughable. Take, for example, the case of the so-called honey trap. This method involved using alluring agents to coax secrets from unsuspecting targets. It was a strategy that relied on the ancient, and often misguided, belief that pillow talk could unlock state secrets. While some agents did manage to glean valuable information, more often than not these operations were little more than exercises in human folly. The lengths to which these governments went were sometimes as amusing as they were desperate. In one particularly memorable instance, a German operative known as Fräulein Doctor was deployed to seduce a British officer. Her mission: obtain details about troop movements. The punchline: the officer, more enamored with his whiskey than his newfound companion, ended up divulging nothing more than his love for a good scotch. So, what does this all mean for us, the intrepid explorers of history's more scandalous corners? It's a lesson in the unpredictable nature of human endeavor. Despite the grand plans of military strategists and intelligence agencies, the results were often dictated by the whims and weaknesses of individuals. It's a reminder that in the shadowy world of espionage, the most powerful weapon might just be the one between the ears rather than beneath the sheets. These stories of Mata Hari and her contemporaries shine a light on the absurdity of war and the human penchant for myth-making. They remind us that behind every legend is a reality that is often mundane, sometimes tragic, and always complex. As we continue to unravel the tangled skein of World War I, let's keep in mind that the truth, with all its messy imperfections, is often far more interesting than the myths we create to make sense of it all. And speaking of myths and realities, hold onto your hats as we delve deeper into the murky waters of wartime intrigue. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of this espionage extravaganza, and trust me, there are more surprises lurking around the corner. Stay tuned, because the world of spies, seduction, and secrets has plenty more tales to tell. As we plunge deeper into the beguiling world of espionage, deception, and desire during World War I, let's shift gears to another fascinating chapter: the moral panic that swept through the ranks of soldiers like a wildfire. In a war riddled with chaos and carnage, you'd think the powers that be would have bigger fish to fry than policing personal behavior. But oh no, the moral guardians were out in full force. Now, let's set the stage. Picture this. Young men, far from home, surrounded by the fog of war and the looming spectre of mortality. It's hardly surprising that they sought comfort in whatever form they could find it. But this didn't sit well with the governments, who seemed hell-bent on maintaining a facade of moral superiority. Cue the propaganda campaigns that were as subtle as a sledgehammer and as effective as a chocolate teapot. The contradictions in government messaging at the time were nothing short of surreal. On one hand, soldiers were hailed as heroes, the very embodiment of courage and virtue. On the other, they were painted as potential vectors of moral decay, a threat to the home front's purity. It was a PR nightmare wrapped in a paradox, and the powers that be were determined to stamp out what they saw as rampant immorality. Enter the propaganda machine, cranking out posters, pamphlets, and films that would make even the most stoic eye roll. These messages often portrayed women as much victims as temptresses, as the root of all evil. The infamous khaki fever propaganda campaign warned of the seductive allure of women waiting to lead the valiant soldier astray. Talk about blaming the victim with a side of fear-mongering. Let's back this up with some numbers, because nothing says we mean business like cold, hard data. In 1918 alone, the British government reportedly spent over £1 million on anti-venereal disease propaganda. That's roughly £60 million in today's money, enough to buy a small fleet of tanks or at least a lifetime supply of Yorkshire tea. Yet, despite the hefty price tag, the message was as mixed as a cocktail at a speakeasy. The societal backlash to these campaigns was nothing short of a cultural shift. Women, particularly those who were seen as working outside traditional roles, nurses, factory workers, and yes, sex workers, were subjected to intense scrutiny and judgment. The irony: these were often the same women who kept the home fires burning while the men were at the front. But let's not forget the real kicker. The government's attempts at enforcing moral discipline within the ranks were about as successful as herding cats. Take the American Expeditionary Forces, for example. General John J. Pershing famously instituted the Pershing Rule, which aimed to curb venereal disease by limiting soldiers' access to alcohol and ensuring they spent their free time in wholesome activities. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Soldiers found ways around these restrictions, proving yet again that necessity is the mother of invention. The futility of these efforts is best illustrated by the numbers. Despite all the moral posturing, venereal disease rates among soldiers remained stubbornly high. In fact, at one point during the war, VD was the second most common reason for soldiers to be hospitalized, right after battle injuries. That's right, more hospital beds were occupied by those suffering from syphilis and gonorrhea than from bullet wounds. It's a grim statistic that underscores the complexity of human behavior in times of crisis. And speaking of complexity, let's address some of the persistent myths that have clung to the fringes of popular culture like barnacles on a ship. One popular narrative suggests that the war was a time of unchecked debauchery, with soldiers indulging in hedonistic escapades at every turn. While it's true that some embraced the live fast, die young mentality, the reality for most was far more mundane. The daily grind of trench warfare, with its mud, blood, and tedium, left little room for bacchanalian revelry. Another myth that deserves a good debunking is the idea that governments were prudish and out of touch. While it's easy to mark the heavy-handedness of their propaganda, it's important to remember the context. These were societies grappling with unprecedented upheaval, and maintaining control, even if it was an illusion, was a priority. The real issue was the staggering disconnect between the official line and the lived reality of soldiers and civilians alike. In the end, the moral panic and propaganda campaigns of World War I serve as a stark reminder of the complexities of human nature. They highlight the gap between idealism and reality, between the mythologized image of the soldier and the flawed, vulnerable human beneath the uniform. It's a tale as old as time, a dance of contradictions that has played out in countless conflicts before and since. As we continue to peel back the layers of this historical onion, let's keep our eyes on the horizon. There's more to uncover in this saga of sex, lies, and the pursuit of purity. a story that refuses to be neatly packaged into the annals of history. So, buckle up, dear listener, because the ride is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as intriguing as the last. Stay tuned, for the tangled web of World War has more secrets to reveal. So, as we wade through the murky waters of World War I's moral crusade, let's pivot to the long shadow it cast on future military endeavors and society at large. The Great War was a veritable Pandora's box of lessons, some learned, others conveniently ignored. It's like the world's most high-stakes classroom, where the curriculum was written in blood, and the exams were matters of life and death. First up, the military's tangled relationship with sexual health. You think that by the end of the war, with venereal disease rates skyrocketing and moral campaigns flopping like a fish on dry land, military strategists would have taken a hard look at their policies. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Instead, many nations doubled down on the illusion that abstinence and moral posturing were enough to keep soldiers in check. It's the equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears and singing loudly when faced with an inconvenient truth. But let's not paint with too broad a brush. There were glimmers of progress, albeit small and largely reactive. By World War II, the US military at least had the good sense to distribute millions of condoms, accompanied by the not-so-subtle slogan, "Don't forget, put it on before you put it in." Catchy, right? This shift in approach, from denial to begrudging acceptance, was a baby step toward acknowledging that soldiers are, in fact, human beings with human needs. By the war's end, the US had distributed over 50 million condoms, a number that speaks volumes about the changing tides. Yet for all these steps forward, the ghost of World War I's puritanical policies has lingered like a stubborn stain. Even today, discussions about sexual health in the military are fraught with controversy. It's as if the lesson that personal behavior can't be legislated away was scribbled in invisible ink. Instead, many governments have preferred to sweep such issues under the rug, hoping that out of sight means out of mind. But let's zoom out and take a look at the societal impact, because the aftermath of World War I was a catalyst for change in more ways than one. The war shattered traditional norms, reshaping gender roles and societal expectations. Women who had stepped into roles as nurses, factory workers, and yes, sex workers, were left in a societal no-man's land when the war ended. The result? A newfound push for women's rights that would ripple through the 20th century. The suffrage movement gained momentum, and by the end of the 1920s, women in many countries had won the right to vote. It was a seismic shift, one that owed much to the war's upheaval. And then there's the matter of how these historical practices have been remembered, or more often misremembered. The romanticized image of the soldier returning from war to a faithful sweetheart has been a staple of wartime narratives, but it's a story as polished as a brass button, ignoring the messy reality. The truth is, the homecomings were often fraught with tension and adjustment as soldiers and their families tried to reconcile the chasm between expectation and reality. In popular culture, the myths of wartime romance and espionage have been perpetuated through countless films and novels. Who doesn't love a good spy thriller or a wartime romance? These narratives, while entertaining, often gloss over the grittier aspects of history, transforming complex human experiences into palatable stories. It's a bit like turning a gritty documentary into a feel-good Hollywood blockbuster. But let's give credit where it's due. These stories, despite their embellishments, serve a purpose. They remind us of the human capacity for resilience and adaptability, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. History, after all, is not just a series of dates and events. It's a tapestry woven from the threads of individual lives, each with its own story to tell. So, where does that leave us, the intrepid explorers of history's more scandalous corners? Well, it leaves us with a renewed appreciation for the messy, complicated reality behind the myths. It's a reminder that history, much like humanity itself, is rarely black and white, but rather a spectrum of grays. The romantic narratives might provide the gloss, but it's the gritty details that give history its depth and texture. As we wrap up this exploration of World War I's more intimate aspects, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons we've unearthed. We've seen how governments grappled with the dual pressures of maintaining military discipline and managing public health. We've explored the societal shifts that the war catalyzed, from changing gender roles to evolving attitudes towards sexual health. And we've pulled back the curtain on the myths that continue to shape our understanding of the past. In the end, the story of World War I's sexual practices is a microcosm of the broader human experience, a tale of survival, adaptation, and the relentless march of time. It's a reminder that history is not just about what happened, but also about how we choose to remember it. So as we close this chapter, let's keep our eyes peeled for the next twist in the tale, because history, like life, is a story that's always unfolding, and there's always more to discover in its pages. Otto von Bismarck, the man who would one day stitch together the patchwork quilt of German states into a unified empire, began life not as a master strategist, but as a notorious wild child. Born on April 1, 1815 in Schönhausen, Bismarck was perhaps destined to leave his mark on the world. April Fool's Day, indeed, a date fitting for a man whose life was a series of unexpected twists, pranks, and let's be honest, a bit of chaos. During his early years, Bismarck wasn't exactly the poster child for scholarly excellence. He attended the University of Göttingen in 1832, where he was more interested in the art of dueling and drinking than in attending lectures. This was a young man who allegedly once boasted of drinking 25 bottles of champagne in a single evening. Now, whether that's a matter of fact, or the sort of tall tale that gets told after the third bottle, it speaks volumes about his priorities at the time. He was a regular at the Nape, the German beer halls where debates could get as heated as the Glühwein. Bismarck's academic career was a bit like a roller coaster that never quite made it up the first hill. He flunked out of Göttingen after just one semester, proving that not all who wander are lost, but they might be failing Latin. He transferred to the University of Berlin, where he managed to scrape together a law degree by 1835. Whether his professors were relieved or just eager to see him out the door is anyone's guess. But let's not pretend that Bismarck's early misadventures were all about academic underachievement. He was also honing the social skills that would make him a political powerhouse. With his gift of gab and towering presence, standing at a formidable 6'4", a veritable giant of his time, he could command a room with the same ease he could empty a stein. It was this charisma that laid the groundwork for his transformation from a so-called wild man into a statesman of epic proportions. The pivot point in Bismarck's life came with his marriage to Johanna von Puttkamer in 1847. Johanna was the yin to his yang, the calm to his storm, a devout, principled woman who managed to ground Bismarck's more tempestuous tendencies. The marriage wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a catalyst for Bismarck's political ambitions. He began to view politics not as a backdrop to his life of leisure, but as the main stage. Their union was a curious one. She was a conservative pietist, while he, at the time, was an unrepentant libertine. But somehow it worked. Perhaps it was Johanna's influence that tempered his wilder instincts and turned his formidable energy toward the more constructive pursuit of political power. He scaled back his drinking and took on the serious business of governance. Although, let's be honest, he never completely abandoned his love for a good drink. It just became more of a weekend hobby than a daily ritual. His political career kicked off in earnest when he was elected to the Prussian Diet in 1847. Now, the Diet wasn't exactly the United Nations General Assembly. It was more like a regional council meeting, but it was the perfect training ground for a man with ambitions as grand as Bismarck's. He quickly earned a reputation as a fierce debater and a staunch defender of the monarchy. One could say he was the original Iron Fist in a velvet glove, though his gloves were probably more like leather and emblazoned with a family crest. The 1850 saw Bismarck cutting his teeth on the diplomatic stage, serving as Prussia's envoy to the German Confederation. It was here that he developed his trademark realpolitik approach, political maneuvering based on practical and material factors rather than moral or ideological considerations. In other words, Bismarck wasn't above sidestepping ethics if it meant getting the job done. He was a pragmatist in a world full of idealists, and he wore it like a badge of honor. By the time he became the Prussian Prime Minister in 1862, Bismarck was a seasoned player in the political arena, ready to tackle the Herculean task of unifying the German states. But that's a saga for another day. For now, let's remember young Otto not as the Iron Chancellor, but as the man who once believed that the best way to handle a university lecture was to skip it for a day at the beer hall. Because, in the end, even the most formidable figures in history were once young rebels with a mischievous streak and a penchant for the unexpected. And thus the stage was set for Otto von Bismarck's meteoric rise, one that would be fueled not by the flicker of idealism, but by the roaring fires of political cunning and sheer force of will. By 1862, Bismarck had graduated from the backbenches of the Prussian Diet to the political big leagues, becoming the Prime Minister of Prussia. It wasn't just any old appointment. It was the moment that transformed a rowdy former student into a statesman who would redraw the map of Europe. Now, let's talk about the infamous Blood and Iron speech. Delivered on September 30, 1862, to the Budget Committee of the Prussian House of Representatives, it wasn't exactly a Shakespearean soliloquy, but it did get the point across. Bismarck, with his usual knack for drama, laid it out plainly. The great questions of the time will not be resolved by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood. In other words, he wasn't planning on knitting Germany together with peace treaties and goodwill. He was betting on the sharp end of a bayonet and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Why the focus on iron? Well, Prussia was on the fast track to becoming an industrial powerhouse. By the 1860, it was already a hotbed for coal and steel production, with the Ruhr Valley acting as the economic engine room. Railways were snaking across the landscape, linking cities and factories in a web of steel. The economic numbers were staggering. Between 1850 and 1870, Prussia's coal production quadrupled and steel output surged. This wasn't just industrial growth. It was a transformation that turned Prussia into a juggernaut, capable of forging weapons of war and plowshares alike. But all that industrial might came with a hefty price tag. Building a modern military was like hosting the world's most expensive dinner party. Everyone wanted a seat at the table, and the bill was astronomical. The Prussian military reforms of the time called for an army that could be mobilized quickly and efficiently. That meant more soldiers, better equipment, and a logistical network that could rival the Roman legions. The cost was eye-watering, with military budgets ballooning to accommodate Bismarck's ambitions. Bismarck's real genius, however, lay in his political maneuvering. He was like a chess grandmaster playing a board filled with pawns who thought they were kings. Take, for example, his dealings with the Prussian parliament. The liberals wanted a say in military spending. Bismarck, not so much. When they refused to approve the budget, Bismarck simply bypassed them, using existing tax revenues to fund his military projects. It was a bold move and a blatant disregard for parliamentary procedure, but it worked. Bismarck had effectively outflanked the opposition, proving that sometimes the best way to win a game is to change the rules. His temper, though legendary, was another tool in his political arsenal. Bismarck was known for his outbursts, which could be as unpredictable as they were explosive. But these tantrums weren't just the result of a short fuse. They were calculated performances, designed to unsettle his opponents and keep them guessing. After all, if you can't outthink your rivals, outshouting them is a close second. It's said that during one particularly heated exchange, Bismarck slammed his fist on the table with such force that he shattered a porcelain inkstand. Was it a display of genuine anger or a piece of political theater? With Bismarck, it was often hard to tell where the man ended and the myth began. And then there was his penchant for cunning strategies that would make Machiavelli proud. Bismarck understood that uniting Germany wouldn't be achieved in the debating halls. It would be won on the battlefield. This wasn't just a matter of military might. It was about timing and alliances. He played the European powers against each other like a maestro conducting a symphony of deceit. His ability to isolate enemies and rally allies was nothing short of masterful. One of his most famous feats of political sleight of hand was the manipulation of the Ems dispatch in 1870, which inflamed tensions with France and led to the Franco-Prussian War. Bismarck edited a telegram from King Wilhelm I to make it sound more provocative, knowing full well that it would provoke the French into declaring war. It was a classic bait-and switch, and it worked like a charm. The resulting conflict not only secured the unification of Germany, but also cemented Bismarck's reputation as a political genius. Yet, even as he consolidated power at home, Bismarck was keenly aware of the economic realities that underpinned his ambitions. Prussia's industrial growth wasn't just a means to an end. It was the foundation upon which the new German Empire would be built. He knew that a strong economy was essential for maintaining a strong military, and vice versa. It was a delicate balance, and Bismarck walked that tightrope with the skill of an acrobat. But let's not romanticize this too much. Bismarck's rise to power was as much about ruthlessness as it was about vision. He wasn't building a utopia, he was forging an empire, one that would be defined as much by its iron-fisted policies as by its industrial might. In the end, Bismarck's Germany would be a place of paradoxes, where the steel mills of the Ruhr coexisted with the military parade grounds of Berlin. So, as Bismarck marched forward with his plans for unification, he did so with a steely resolve and a cunning mind, always one step ahead of his rivals and 2 steps ahead of his allies. His story was far from over, and the path ahead would be fraught with challenges and opportunities alike. But for now, let's raise a glass, preferably not one of those 25 champagne bottles, and toast to the Iron Chancellor, the man who turned a patchwork of states into a formidable empire through a combination of blood, iron, and a fair bit of audacity. Stay tuned, because the saga of Otto von Bismarck is just getting started. And so, Bismarck found himself at the precipice, ready to dive into the swirling maelstrom of 19th century European politics with a confidence that can only be described as audacious. The wars of unification were not just battles fought on muddy fields, but intricate games of diplomatic chess, with Bismarck moving pieces across a board that spanned the entire continent. First on his agenda, the Danish War of 1864. Now, the Danish War didn't exactly have the world quaking in its boots. It was more of a regional skirmish, but for Bismarck, it was the perfect proving ground. The conflict revolved around the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, territories that were about as disputed as the last slice of pizza among friends. The Danes, bless their hearts, thought they could incorporate Schleswig into their kingdom, ignoring the fact that it was a bit like trying to wear someone else's shoes, uncomfortable and likely to cause blisters. Enter Bismarck, stage right, with an alliance that would make any strategist proud. He teamed up with Austria, a frenemy if ever there was one, to teach Denmark a lesson in geopolitics. The war was swift, lasting just a few months, and ended with the Treaty of Vienna. Bismarck pried Schleswig from Denmark's grasp, while Austria took Holstein. It was a diplomatic and military victory wrapped in a shiny ribbon of territorial gain. But as with any good drama, there was a twist. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 was the next act, and it was a doozy. Bismarck, ever the cunning tactician, had set the stage for conflict with Austria. He knew they were like 2 roosters in a henhouse. Eventually, one would have to go. The spark was Schleswig-Holstein, because why let a good duchy go to waste when it can be used as a casus belli? Here's where Bismarck's genius really shone. He isolated Austria diplomatically, securing neutrality from France and Italy. It was a classic divide-and-conquer move, the kind that would make Machiavelli blush. The war itself was a rapid affair, lasting just 7 weeks, earning it the nickname, the 7 Weeks' War. Prussia's modernized military, fueled by that industrial might we mentioned earlier, steamrolled the Austrians at the Battle of Königgrätz. The numbers tell the story. 200,000 Prussian troops clashed with 215,000 Austrians, but superior tactics and technology turned the tide in Prussia's favor. The result, the Treaty of Prague, where Austria was graciously allowed to exit the German Confederation stage left, leaving Prussia as the dominant power in the German states. Bismarck, ever the magnanimous victor, offered Austria relatively lenient terms, avoiding the harsh reprisals that could have sowed the seeds of future grudges. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, ensuring Austria wouldn't seek revenge anytime soon. But the piece de resistance was yet to come. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 was Bismarck's magnum opus, the culmination of his unification efforts. The road to war was paved with tension and telegrams, specifically the infamous Ems dispatch. A seemingly innocuous telegram from King Wilhelm, I was edited by Bismarck to sound like a slap in the face to France. The French, predictably, took the bait and declared war. a move that played right into Bismarck's hands. This was no ordinary conflict. It was a symphony of military might and media manipulation. The Prussian army, now a well-oiled machine thanks to Bismarck's reforms, marched into France with the precision of a Swiss watch. The siege of Paris was a particularly dramatic affair, with the city holding out for months before capitulating. Meanwhile, Bismarck's use of the telegraph was revolutionary, a 19th-century version of going viral. He controlled the narrative, ensuring that public opinion in Germany and beyond supported his actions. The numbers from the war are staggering. Around 380,000 French soldiers faced off against 500,000 Germans, and the cost was high, both in human lives and in economic terms. But for Bismarck, it was all part of the grand design. The war ended with the Treaty of Frankfurt, which saw France ceding the territories of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany, a bitter pill for the French to swallow and a strategic triumph for Bismarck. But let's talk about the ironies and absurdities. Picture Bismarck negotiating peace terms with the French while lounging in his nightshirt, puffing away on a cigar. It's the kind of image that conjures up a sense of surrealism, like something out of a political cartoon. Here was a man who could switch from battlefield tactics to bedside diplomacy without missing a beat. It's this ability to pivot, literally and figuratively, that made Bismarck such a formidable force. Yet, for all his successes, Bismarck's story is tinged with the complexities of human nature. His tactics were ruthless, his methods Machiavellian, but they were undeniably effective. He wasn't building a house of cards. He was constructing a fortress of steel and strategy. The unification of Germany wasn't just a political or military achievement. It was an economic revolution. The newly unified German Empire was an industrial juggernaut, its economy booming thanks to the resources and infrastructure Bismarck had so painstakingly orchestrated. And thus, the wars of unification were not merely about drawing lines on a map. They were about reshaping the very fabric of Europe. Bismarck's legacy is one of paradoxes, a testament to the power of pragmatic politics over idealism, of iron over sentiment. His story is far from over, and as we delve deeper into the saga of the Iron Chancellor, remember that history is as much about the shadows as it is about the light. Stay tuned, because the next chapter promises more intrigue, more power plays, and no doubt, more lessons in the art of realpolitik. And so we find ourselves at a pivotal moment in history, with Bismarck standing victorious in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles on January 18, 1871. Picture it. A room dripping with opulence, mirrors reflecting the triumphant faces of German princes and military leaders as they watched King Wilhelm, I of Prussia, be proclaimed Kaiser Wilhelm, I of the newly minted German Empire. Talk about a power move, choosing the very heart of France's former glory to declare a new era. Bismarck, ever the maestro of political theater, had orchestrated a finale worthy of a standing ovation. But let's not get swept away in the pomp and circumstance. Unifying Germany was akin to herding cats. Each of the 25 states, from mighty Bavaria to tiny Anhalt, had its own culture, laws, and grudges. It was a political jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were trying to fit themselves upside down. Bismarck, ever the pragmatist, knew that the glue holding this patchwork together had to be stronger than mere sentiment. Enter the economic boom. Germany's industrial revolution was already in full swing, turbocharged by the integration of regional economies into a national powerhouse. Railways, the internet of their day, knit the empire together, with over 18,000 miles of track by 1875. Coal and steel production skyrocketed, transforming the Ruhr Valley into the beating heart of this industrial beast. By 1913, Germany would produce more steel than Britain and France combined. It was an economic growth spurt that would make any teenager jealous. But with great economic power came even greater social challenges. Bismarck had to ensure that the newly unified empire didn't disintegrate into chaos. Think of it as trying to host a dinner party where half the guests are allergic to the main course. The cultural and religious divides were particularly thorny. Enter the culture camp, Bismarck's not-so-subtle attempt to wrestle control away from the Catholic Church. He saw the Church as a potential rival in loyalty, because who needs a pope when you've got a Kaiser, right? The culture camp, or culture struggle, was a series of policies enacted in the 1870 that aimed to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church in state affairs. Bismarck implemented laws that placed education and marriage under state control, expelled the Jesuits, and required clergy to undergo state examinations. It was like a bureaucratic smackdown, a tug-of-war between pulpit and parliament. But here's the kicker. It didn't exactly go as planned. The Catholics doubled down, forming the Centre Party and using the political system to defend their rights. Bismarck, realizing he couldn't strong-arm his way through this one, eventually had to backpedal. It's a classic case of biting off more than you can chew, and then having to politely spit it out. Yet, in typical Bismarckian style, he didn't let one setback slow him down. If the Kulturkampf was a rough draft, his social welfare policies were the polished final essay. Now, don't mistake this for altruism. Bismarck wasn't some 19th century Robin Hood. His pioneering social welfare programs were as much about control as they were about care. An opiate for the masses, if you will. He introduced sickness insurance in 1883, accident insurance in 1884, and old age pensions in 1889. This was a revolutionary move, a political masterstroke, offering just enough comfort to keep the working class from reaching for their pitchforks. But here's the irony. These programs, designed to bolster imperial loyalty, were also a tactical response to the growing socialist movement. The Social Democratic Party was gaining traction, and Bismarck knew that throwing them a bone, or in this case, a pension, might prevent them from gnawing at the foundations of his empire. It was a brilliant act of political jiu-jitsu, flipping socialist demands into state-sponsored initiatives. Despite the economic and social machinations, Bismarck wasn't blind to the cracks in his empire's foundation. The integration of diverse states required more than just economic incentives and legislative sleight of hand. It demanded a national identity, a sense of belonging that transcended regional loyalties. Schools became breeding grounds for patriotism, their curricula carefully curated to instill a sense of German unity. Yet, for all the unifying efforts, regional identities persisted. Bavarians clung to their lederhosen and distinct dialects, while Prussians maintained their stiff-upper-lip militarism. And let's not forget the linguistic patchwork. Over 200 German dialects, each as unique as a snowflake, woven into the fabric of everyday life. It was like trying to play a symphony when half the orchestra insisted on tuning their instruments differently. Bismarck's Germany was a land of contrasts. Industrial might alongside agrarian tradition, progressive social policies shadowed by autocratic governance. The Iron Chancellor himself was a paradox, a conservative who enacted some of the most progressive policies of his time, a diplomat of peace who wasn't afraid to use the sword. His legacy was one of complexity, a testament to the tangled web of ambition and ideology. So, as we leave Bismarck at the helm of this newly crafted empire, it's clear that the unification of Germany was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, maintaining cohesion in a nation stitched together by diplomacy and iron, a nation whose future would be as unpredictable as its past. Stay tuned, because the saga of the Iron Chancellor continues, with more political tightropes to walk and historical myths to unravel. As Bismarck navigated the turbulent waters of his newly forged empire, the Iron Chancellor was acutely aware that every triumph carried the seed of its own undoing. His later years were marked by a delicate balancing act, akin to juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle on a high wire. If ever there was a time for Bismarck to rest on his laurels, this wasn't it. The political landscape was shifting, and the sands of time were beginning to erode even the most ironclad alliances. Fast forward to the 1880, and Bismarck's Germany was a colossus straddling the European continent. But with great power came an even greater need for diplomacy. Bismarck knew that keeping the peace was like trying to keep a lid on a pressure cooker. His solution, the famed system of alliances that he meticulously crafted, a diplomatic spider's web designed to keep potential adversaries at bay. The Triple Alliance of 1882, tying Germany to Austria-Hungary and Italy, was his piece de resistance, a geopolitical insurance policy against the ever-looming threat of a two-front war. But here's the catch. Bismarck's alliances were as much about keeping France isolated as they were about fostering friendships. It was a bit like hosting a party and only inviting people who owe you money. The reinsurance treaty with Russia in 1887 was another masterstroke, an attempt to keep the Russian bear from cozying up to France. Yet for all his cunning, Bismarck was playing a game with more variables than a calculus textbook, and his retirement in 1890 would leave his carefully constructed system vulnerable. And retire he did, or rather, he was pushed. Enter Kaiser Wilhelm Roman II, the young monarch with a penchant for naval uniforms and grand gestures. Wilhelm, eager to make his own mark, saw Bismarck's cautious diplomacy as an archaic relic. The Iron Chancellor was shown the door in March 1890, marking the end of an era. It was the classic tale of the old guard versus the new, with Bismarck's dismissal symbolizing a shift from realpolitik to a more aggressive and ultimately perilous foreign policy. But what of Bismarck's legacy? The man who had once declared that politics was the art of the possible left behind a Germany that was both a titan and a tinderbox. His unification of Germany was a triumph of will and wit, yet the very empire he had stitched together was a patchwork of simmering tensions. The seeds of world war were sown in the fertile soil of his ambitions, a grim irony that history would not overlook. Bismarck's social policies, too, were a double-edged sword. His welfare state set the precedent for modern social security systems, yet it was also a tool of control, a way to pacify the masses while consolidating power. It's easy to romanticize his reforms as benevolent foresight, but let's not forget the realpolitik at play. Bismarck was no altruist. He was a shrewd operator who understood that a content populace was less likely to riot. As for the man himself, Bismarck was a bundle of contradictions. A junker with the heart of a gambler, whose temper was as legendary as his strategic prowess. He could be as charming as he was intimidating, a man who wielded his charisma like a weapon. His penchant for bombast and bravado was matched only by his ability to read the political room. To borrow from the lexicon of modern cinema, Bismarck was the anti-hero of his own saga, a figure whose flaws were as compelling as his feats. And so, as the sun set on the Bismarckian era, the Iron Chancellor's influence lingered like the aftertaste of a particularly strong schnapps. His policies had reshaped Europe, yet the very fabric of his empire was unraveling at the seams. The alliances he had crafted with such care would crumble in the face of new ambitions, leading Germany down a path fraught with peril and ultimately war. In the end, Bismarck's life was a testament to the complexities of power and the paradoxes of leadership. He was a man who had unified a nation only to see it teeter on the brink of chaos. His legacy is one of iron and irony, a reminder that even the most formidable figures are but players in the vast, unpredictable theater of history. So here's to Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, the architect of a unified Germany, and the man whose shadow loomed long after he had left the stage. As we close the book on his remarkable life, we do so with the understanding that history, like Bismarck himself, is never as simple as it seems. In the year 1837, an 18-year-old girl named Alexandrina Victoria woke up to a destiny she hardly anticipated. She was now Queen Victoria, ruler of an empire that spanned continents and cultures, all while most of us were still figuring out how to use both a knife and fork simultaneously. But let's not jump ahead. Victoria's life was a cocktail of royal drama and teenage rebellion even before she got the crown. Victoria's childhood was like a Jane Austen novel if Jane decided to add a dash of reality TV drama. She was born in 1819, a time when horses were the main mode of transportation, and the British Empire was playing monopoly with real countries. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, had the foresight to leave the party early. He died when Victoria was just 8 months old. Her mom, the Duchess of Kent, took the reins and tried to micromanage Victoria's life like a helicopter mom with a crown. And boy, did she micromanage. Victoria's upbringing was governed by something called the Kensington system, which sounds like a fancy British boarding school, but was more like a royal version of house arrest. The rules were simple. Victoria couldn't walk down the stairs without holding someone's hand, and she had to ask permission to leave the room. Yes, you heard that right. The future Empress of India Had to ask if she could take a bathroom break. Talk about royal flush. The Duchess surrounded young Victoria with a close-knit group of advisors, hoping to mold her into a proper queen. This included Sir John Conroy, a man so ambitious he probably tried to crown himself when no one was looking. Conroy aimed to be the power behind the throne, but Victoria was having none of it. She saw through his ambitions like a transparent ghost at a Halloween party. Victoria's relationship with her mother was a mix of love, resentment, and the occasional eye roll, kind of like a long episode of Keeping Up with the Kents. The Duchess insisted on sleeping in the same room as Victoria until she became queen. Just imagine being a teenager and sharing your space with your mom 24/7. No wonder Victoria was eager to get her own pad at Buckingham Palace. Now, let's talk about her surprise ascension to the throne. King William Roman IV, Victoria's uncle, was about as healthy as a Victorian coal miner. Everyone knew his days were numbered, but when he finally kicked the bucket in the summer of 1837, Victoria was jolted awake at 6 a.m. by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain. Forget breakfast in bed. Victoria got a crown. Here's where things get deliciously awkward. Her coronation was the ultimate coming-of-age party, attended by an eclectic mix of lords, ladies, and diplomats who all probably had their own agendas scribbled on the back of their invitations. The ceremony cost a whopping £79,000, which in today's money could probably buy you a decent-sized island. The crown itself was a headpiece so heavy it could double as a medieval weapon. Despite the weight, Victoria handled it with the grace of someone who grew up carrying the burdens of a kingdom. The coronation wasn't without its comic relief. Just imagine a congregation of nobles, all decked out in their finest, awkwardly trying to follow the ceremony's elaborate rituals without tripping over their own robes. At one point, an elderly peer accidentally sat on his coronation robe, pulling it right off his shoulders as he stood up. If you've ever seen a cat trying to walk with a piece of tape stuck to its paw, you get the picture. Victoria, now officially the Queen, began to assert her independence from her mother and Conroy. She moved into Buckingham Palace and relished the freedom like a college freshman finally escaping curfew. She even banned her mother from living in the main palace quarters, relegating her to a suite in a distant wing. That's one way to set boundaries. These early days of Victoria's reign were pivotal. She had to navigate a political landscape as complicated as her family dynamics. England was on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, and the country was buzzing with innovation and unrest. Victoria inherited a kingdom that was both a global powerhouse and a pressure cooker of social change. Victoria's early reign also saw the rise of the British middle class and the decline of the aristocracy's iron grip on power. It was a time when the steam engine was revolutionizing transport, and the telegraph was making communication faster than the speed of gossip. Amidst this whirlwind, Victoria had to quickly learn the ropes of governance, all while maintaining her royal composure. Her reign would become iconic, not just for the empire's expansion, but for her personal evolution from a sheltered teenager to a monarch who redefined what it meant to be royal. But before all that, she had to deal with the small matter of running a country, and maybe asking for a little privacy along the way. Now, as Victoria settled into her role, there was one more royal duty looming like an unfinished Jane Austen novel: marriage. Enter Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Picture a young man with the looks of a romantic poet, but the mindset of a Victorian engineer. The match was orchestrated by Uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians, who seemed to fancy himself as a royal matchmaker, playing Cupid with a crown and a scepter. Their first meeting wasn't exactly love at first sight. Victoria described Albert as having a pleasant and wise face, which is the 19th century equivalent of saying someone has a great personality. But as they corresponded, a genuine bond began to form, like a Regency-era rom-com, minus the witty banter, and plus a lot of formal salutations. So, in 1840, the two tied the knot in a ceremony that could only be described as the mother of all royal weddings. The event cost roughly £30,000, which today might buy you a decent engagement ring from a fancy jeweler. Victoria wore a white gown, setting a trend for brides everywhere, though she probably wasn't thinking about future bridal magazines at the time. Now, let's get into the nuts and bolts, or should I say, the tiaras and top hats of their marriage. Despite the arranged beginnings, Victoria and Albert's relationship evolved into a genuine partnership. They were yin and yang, or more accurately, queen and prince consort. Victoria was the public figure, while Albert was the intellectual powerhouse behind the scenes, taking a keen interest in the arts, sciences, and, believe it or not, plumbing. Yes, Albert was obsessed with modernizing the royal residences, and his enthusiasm for plumbing improvements was like a Victorian HGTV marathon. He oversaw the installation of the first flushing toilet in Buckingham Palace, a move that was both groundbreaking and, quite literally, relieving. Imagine the royal household finally waving goodbye to the chamber part era. Talk about a throne upgrade. Their partnership extended beyond domestic comforts. They shared a passion for arts and sciences, hosting exhibitions that showcased everything from paintings to the latest industrial inventions. This was a time when the Great Exhibition of 1851 was the talk of the town, a dazzling display of innovation attended by over 6 million people. It was like the world's first tech expo, with Albert as its chief visionary. But let's not gloss over the reality of their domestic life. Victoria and Albert were parents to 9 children, and if you think keeping up with the Kardashians is chaotic, try keeping track of the offspring of a queen and a prince consort. Their brood included 4 sons and 5 daughters, who were strategically married off into European royalty, earning Victoria the nickname Grandmother of Europe. This was less about family ties and more about political strategy. Think Game of Thrones, but with fewer dragons and more diplomatic dinners. Victoria's diaries give us a peek behind the royal curtain, and let's just say motherhood wasn't her favorite crown to wear. She found pregnancy and child-rearing to be a royal pain, candidly describing her frustrations in entries that were refreshingly human and occasionally exasperated. Her honesty about the challenges of motherhood was like a 19th century confession blog, adding a relatable twist to her otherwise regal image. Despite the occasional parental headache, Victoria and Albert's marriage was a cornerstone of her reign. It was a partnership that balanced the demands of public life with the complexities of personal relationships. They were like the original power couple, navigating the choppy waters of politics and parenthood with a mix of love, ambition, and a fair share of stubbornness. As the years went by, their shared interests in innovation and societal progress left a lasting mark on the kingdom. Under their influence, Britain embarked on a path of modernity, embracing the Industrial Revolution with open arms, and of course, improved plumbing. But Victoria's story, with its blend of fairy tale romance and harsh realities, was far from over. There were more challenges ahead, both personal and political, as the empire continued to expand and evolve. This iconic royal couple, with their mix of pageantry and practicality, laid the groundwork for a new era. Yet, despite the grandeur and the global influence, at the heart of it all was a marriage that was as human as it was historic. And as Victoria's reign continued, it was a reminder that even the grandest of tales are woven from the simplest of truths: love, ambition, and the occasional need to update the plumbing. Now, as we dive deeper into the political labyrinth of Queen Victoria's reign, it's crucial to remember that while she may have started as a teenage monarch with a crown slightly too big for her head, she didn't just sit around sipping Earl Grey and knitting royal socks. Oh no, Victoria had a knack for wielding influence, even if history sometimes paints her as a passive figurehead. You see, Victoria's reign coincided with a time when Britain's political landscape was as turbulent as a British summer, unpredictable and often damp with conflict. The Reform Acts, the rise of the working class, and the Chartist movements were all swirling around like a political tempest. And in the eye of this storm was a queen who, contrary to popular belief, wasn't merely a regal rubber stamp. Let's talk about those prime ministers who had the pleasure, or perhaps the pain, of working with Victoria. She had a total of 10 during her reign, but 2 in particular stand out: Lord Melbourne and Benjamin Disraeli. Now, Melbourne was Victoria's first prime minister, and arguably her political mentor. Picture a man who was as suave as he was savvy. Melbourne had the political finesse of a seasoned diplomat and the charm of a Regency-era Mr. Darcy, minus the brooding. Victoria adored Melbourne, referring to him as her dearest friend, and even recording in her diary that she blindly trusted him. But this wasn't just a case of puppy love. Melbourne's influence on Victoria was profound. He educated her in the art of politics, shaping her understanding of governance at a time when the lines between monarchy and parliament were being redrawn faster than a kid with a new box of crayons. Melbourne's resignation in 1841 was a political gut punch for Victoria. Enter Sir Robert Peel, a man with a face like a stern headmaster and policies to match. Peel and Victoria's relationship was frostier than a British winter morning. Unlike Melbourne, Peel wasn't interested in indulging the young Queen's whims. Their power struggle came to a head in what is famously known as the bedchamber crisis of 1839. Victoria refused to dismiss her Whig ladies-in-waiting, and Peel, feeling undermined, stepped down. It was like a 19th century political soap opera, complete with dramatic exits and teary diary entries. But fast forward to Benjamin Disraeli, a man who knew how to play the political game like a maestro conducts a symphony. Disraeli was a charmer, a rider, and a statesman with a flair for the dramatic. He famously flattered Victoria with lines like, "We authors, ma'am," and knew how to make her feel both respected and influential. Disraeli's relationship with Victoria was mutually beneficial. He gained her support for his policies, and she found a political ally who valued her opinions. These interactions highlight how Victoria wasn't just a figurehead to be paraded about during state occasions. She was actively engaged, sometimes stubbornly so, in the political discourse of the day. Her influence was subtle yet significant, a bit like a quiet nudge that could tip the scales of power without causing a diplomatic earthquake. Now, let's debunk another myth, the idea that Victoria was a mere puppet to her prime ministers. Victoria had strong opinions, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. Her diaries reveal a monarch who was deeply concerned with the moral and social issues of her time, from the abolition of slavery to the expansion of the British Empire. She wasn't averse to pushing back against policies she disagreed with, though she often did so with a diplomacy that was both regal and pragmatic. Victoria's reign was a time of immense change, both at home and abroad. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the British economy faster than you can say cart and gin, and the empire was expanding like a Victorian waistline after a Christmas feast. Amidst this backdrop, Victoria had to navigate a political landscape that was shifting as rapidly as the steam trains crisscrossing the country. But let's not forget her penchant for stubbornness. Victoria had a will of iron, and once she set her mind on something, it was as immovable as Stonehenge. This trait was both a strength and a flaw. Her determination ensured she wasn't easily swayed, but it also meant she occasionally dug in her heels, sometimes to her own detriment. Her relationship with Ireland, for instance, was marked by a reluctance to visit and engage, despite being the sovereign of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This reluctance was a political sore point, contributing to tensions that simmered throughout her reign. Yet, for all her obstinacy, Victoria was nothing if not adaptable. She evolved over the years, learning to balance her personal beliefs with the demands of a constitutional monarchy. Her ability to do so was a testament to her intelligence and her understanding of the time she lived in. Victoria's reign saw the gradual shift of power from the monarchy to the parliament, and she navigated this transition with a blend of grace and grit. In the end, Victoria's political influence was like a well-brewed cup of tea, subtle but potent, with just the right amount of strength to leave a lasting impression. She wasn't the passive monarch of popular myth, nor was she the all-powerful ruler of romanticized narratives. Instead, she was a complex figure, one who wielded her influence with a careful combination of charm, stubbornness, and an acute understanding of her role in history. So, as we close this chapter on Victoria's political acumen, let's remember that her reign was far more than just a series of royal events and ceremonial duties. It was a time of transformation, both for the Queen and for the country she ruled. And while the next part of her story awaits, filled with more challenges and triumphs, one thing is certain. Queen Victoria was a monarch who left an indelible mark on history, one sharp-tongued comment at a time. But let's shift our gaze from the political chessboard to the broader cultural panorama of the Victorian era, a time when Britain was the world's unofficial trendsetter, whether it was in fashion, technology, or the art of sipping tea with a pinky raised. The British Empire was expanding like a waistline after a holiday feast, painting half the world map in red, and with it, the cultural impact of the Victorian era was as wide-reaching as it was perplexing. First up, fashion. Because let's face it, nothing says, "I'm from the 19th century," quite like a corset you can barely breathe in. The Victorian fashion scene was a curious blend of opulence and restraint, much like the era's social norms. Women's dresses were architectural masterpieces, often requiring the structural integrity of a small Gothic cathedral. Layers upon layers of fabric, lace, and whalebone corsets created silhouettes that flowed like a river, but felt more like a straitjacket. The cost of these outfits could easily reach the equivalent of a modern-day luxury car, yet women wore them with the grace of someone who hadn't just lost a battle with a sewing machine. Men weren't spared either. Their attire was a paradox of style and discomfort, with cravats tied so tightly you'd think they were trying to set a world record for longest time without breathing. Top hats were all the rage, the bigger, the better, perfect for storing all those unspoken societal expectations. And let's not forget the mutton chop sideburns that were less about facial hair and more about marking one's territory on their own face. They were the Victorian version of a no trespassing sign. Etiquette followed suit, or rather, it dictated the suit you should follow. Victorian society was obsessed with manners, rules, and knowing which fork to use when the soup arrived. Imagine living in a world where how you held your teacup could determine your social standing. The complexity of Victorian etiquette was like a game of chess, but instead of pawns and knights, it was all about the right curtsy and the correct angle for your hat. Amidst this sartorial and social rigmarole, Queen Victoria became the poster child for Victorian values, often without even trying. She was the epitome of prudishness, at least in the public eye, while behind palace doors, she wasn't as Victorian as her era might suggest. Her diaries reveal a woman of passionate opinions and human desires, a far cry from the stiff, unyielding matron history likes to portray. Yet the image stuck, and soon Victoria herself was a brand, the face of a movement that preached decorum and demureness like gospel. Now, onto the Industrial Revolution, the chaotic sibling in the Victorian family of progress. It was a time when Britain was undergoing a transformation akin to a caffeine-fueled overnight study session. Steam engines puffed along new railways, factories sprang up like mushrooms after rain, and the telegraph was sending news faster than a Victorian gossip could spread a rumor. By the end of the 19th century, the British textile industry was producing more than half of the world's cotton cloth, a testament to the era's productive prowess. But with great progress came great disparity. The Industrial Revolution was as much about child labor and tenement housing as it was about innovation and economic growth. The factories were the heart of Britain's newfound economic power, but they were also places where 14-hour workdays were the norm, and safety regulations were as rare as a polite debate in Parliament. The average life expectancy for a factory worker was a meager 35 years, a stark contrast to the opulence enjoyed by the upper echelons of society. Yet, through the smog and the soot, there was a sense of optimism, an unshakable belief in progress, and the potential for a better future. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the stunning Crystal Palace, was a testament to this spirit. It was the world's first international exposition, showcasing everything from the latest steam engines to a full-sized printing press, attracting over 6 million visitors. The exhibit was the Victorian equivalent of a TED talk, where innovation was celebrated and the future seemed boundless. Queen Victoria, with her German-born husband Albert, was a champion of this progress, albeit with a few reservations. While she marveled at technological advancements, she also feared the societal upheaval they brought. The rise of the working class, empowered by new opportunities and a growing sense of political consciousness, was a double-edged sword for Victoria. On one hand, it promised a more egalitarian society. On the other, it threatened the established order she represented. This dichotomy was reflected in the literature of the time. Writers like Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters captured the essence of Victorian society, the grandeur and the grime, the progress and the poverty. Dickens' Hard Times painted a vivid picture of industrial life, while the Brontes explored the complexities of human relationships amidst rigid social structures. These works were not just stories, they were social commentaries, reflecting the era's tensions and triumphs. As the British Empire spread its tentacles across the globe, it wasn't just tea and spices that flowed back to England. Ideas, cultures, and sometimes entire populations were caught in the imperial net. The empire was a melting pot of contradictions, bringing wealth and innovation to the metropole, while often leaving chaos and exploitation in its wake. The sun never set on the British Empire, but for many of its subjects, it barely rose. Victoria, as the symbolic head of this vast realm, became a figure of both admiration and satire. She was the regal matriarch of a global family, yet also the target of political cartoons that poked fun at her stature and her sometimes dour disposition. The empire's expansion was as much about diplomacy and trade as it was about gunboats and coercion, and Victoria's role was both a unifying symbol and a lightning rod for criticism. So, was Queen Victoria the embodiment of prudishness or progress? The answer, much like the era she defined, is not so black and white. She was both and neither, a monarch who straddled the line between tradition and transformation. In her reign, we see the birth of modern Britain, with all its contradictions and complexities, a nation that was both a beacon of progress and a bastion of conservatism. But this story isn't over yet. As we look to the next chapter, it's clear that the Victorian era was not just a historical period, but a cultural phenomenon, one that continues to influence our world today. And as we navigate the remaining twists and turns of Victoria's reign, let's keep in mind that history, much like fashion, has a way of coming back around, often with a twist we never quite expect. As we ponder the Victorian era's lasting impact, we must also turn our attention to the woman at its helm, Queen Victoria herself. Ah, Queen Victoria, a name that conjures images of a stern lady clad in black, forever in mourning. But hold onto your top hats, because that image is about as accurate as a weather forecast in an English summer. Victoria's life after the death of her beloved Albert in 1861 is often shrouded in myths of endless grief and seclusion. Yes, she was devastated. Who wouldn't be after losing a partner who was both a confidant and an intellectual equal? But the idea of her spending the next 40 years wallowing in sorrow is as misleading as a Victorian corset advertisement promising comfort. In reality, Victoria was far too pragmatic to let grief derail her duties for long. The Queen initially withdrew from public life, yes, but she wasn't exactly sitting idle, crocheting lace doilies in the dark corners of Windsor Castle. No, Victoria was busy reshaping her role as a monarch and a mother. She continued to engage with her prime ministers and made pivotal decisions that emphasized her influence. She was like a chess player who, after losing her favorite piece, recalibrates to outmaneuver her opponents with sheer strategy. Victoria's mourning attire didn't just symbolize her personal loss. It was a calculated statement. It allowed her to maintain a public image of the grieving widow while strengthening her moral authority. And let's not forget the business side of things. Victoria was no stranger to economic strategies that boosted the British Empire. She oversaw an era of industrial expansion that saw Britain become the workshop of the world, producing over 50% of the world's iron and coal by the late 19th century. Despite the Sama wardrobe, Victoria's reign was a time of vibrant diplomatic activity. She played the role of the grandmother of Europe with gusto, orchestrating marriages for her children and grandchildren like a royal matchmaker on a mission. Her descendants ended up scattered across European thrones, knitting a web of alliances that was both diplomatic genius and a family reunion gone international. Victoria's later years also saw a shift in public perception. Initially criticized for her seclusion, the Queen gradually re-emerged, thanks in part to the influence of her prime ministers. Benjamin Disraeli, in particular, saw the value in reviving Victoria's public image, famously crowning her Empress of India in 1876. This move wasn't just about titles. It was a shrewd political maneuver that bolstered the monarchy's relevance at a time when Republican sentiments were percolating through Europe like a forgotten teapot on the stove. As the 19th century drew to a close, Victoria became a living symbol of British continuity amidst global upheaval. Her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 wasn't just a royal knees-up. It was a celebration of an empire at its zenith, a spectacle that saw representatives from across the Commonwealth parade through London in a display of unity and imperial might. Over 400 million people, about a quarter of the world's population at the time, were subjects of her realm. Yet beneath the pageantry, Victoria remained a complex figure, navigating the tensions between tradition and modernity. Her personal writings reveal a woman of sharp wit and even sharper opinions, far removed from the caricature of a monarch fossilized by grief. Her correspondence with her family and ministers shows a leader who was deeply involved in the machinations of her empire, balancing diplomacy with the demands of a constitutional monarchy. When Victoria passed away on January 22, 1901, at the ripe old age of 81, it truly marked the end of an era. Her death was not just the passing of a queen, but the closing chapter of a century that saw Britain transform from a cluster of islands into a global superpower. Her reign had lasted 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days, longer than any of her predecessors. The Victorian era left an indelible mark on the world, from the industrial landscapes of Britain to the far-flung corners of a sprawling empire. But what about Victoria's own legacy? How did she, a sheltered princess thrust into the limelight, become an emblematic figurehead whose name would define an entire age? Her transformation was a testament to her adaptability and resilience. Victoria navigated personal tragedies, political storms, and societal changes with a tenacity that belied her diminutive stature. She was a queen who understood the power of symbolism, wielding her image like a masterful artist with a paintbrush, crafting a narrative that balanced the weight of tradition with the winds of progress. And yet, the legend of Victoria often overshadows the reality. She wasn't the demure, unyielding monarch of popular myth, nor was she the all-knowing sovereign of romanticized history. Instead, she was a multifaceted figure, a woman of her time, and yet ahead of it, grappling with the challenges of leadership in an era of unprecedented change. Victoria's reign shaped modern perceptions of British royalty, leaving a lasting, if not entirely accurate, impression. Her era was one of paradoxes, a time of prudishness and progress, of imperial grandeur and social inequality. And at its heart was a queen who defied simple categorization, a ruler whose story continues to intrigue and inspire. As we close the book on Queen Victoria, let's remember that history is never as neat as we'd like it to be. It's messy, complex, and often surprising, much like Victoria herself. Her legacy is a tapestry woven from the threads of ambition, love, and the occasional royal scandal. And while her era may have ended, its influence lingers on, a testament to a queen who, despite her petite frame, left footprints that stretch across continents and through time. So next time you find yourself sipping tea or witnessing a royal wedding, spare a thought for Queen Victoria. She may have been a product of her age, but in many ways she defined it, leaving a legacy that remains as captivating as the woman herself. As the first light of dawn creeps over the Nile, your day as an ancient Egyptian baker begins. The air is cool and calm, a luxury that will soon disappear as the sun rises, ready to roast the sands and stones around you. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The morning is still fresh, and so are you. Your feet hit the dusty ground, and you shake off sleep like a pro. After all, you've got dough to make and a whole community to feed. The Nile, that life-giving artery of Egypt, winds lazily past. It's not just a picturesque river from some postcard fantasy. It's the reason you've got a job. It floods predictably, like clockwork, leaving behind rich silt that makes your emmer wheat and barley grow like they've got something to prove. And you're the lucky one who turns these grains into bread, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of gold bars. Speaking of grains, let's talk about what fills your bakery. Emmer wheat and barley are your mainstays. Forget about modern wheat with its fluffy loaves. These grains are hardier and more stubborn, much like your average Pharaoh. Emmer wheat is a bit of a diva, demanding extra steps to separate the grain from the husk. But you're not complaining. This is your bread and butter, quite literally. Your tools are simple but effective. Grinding stones are your best friends, though they're as heavy as a grudge. You use them to crush the grains into flour. And let's not sugarcoat it. This is backbreaking work. But hey, at least you've got a flatbread oven, which is basically a clay pot you heat from the inside. It's like a prehistoric pizza oven, minus the pepperoni. Bread is more than food in ancient Egypt. It's currency, status, and sustenance rolled into one. This is where the barter system comes into play. Forget coins. Those are for future folks. You trade loaves for goods and services like a boss. Need a new pair of sandals. That'll be 3 loaves, thank you very much. Bread is the economy's backbone, and you're the vertebrae. Let's debunk a myth while we're at it. Ancient Egypt isn't just about pyramids and pharaohs lounging around in gold-plated everything. The reality is a bit grittier. Life as a baker is no walk along the Nile. You work long hours, often from sunup to sundown, and your hands have the calluses to prove it. Sure, there's a romantic allure to baking bread in the shadow of ancient monuments, but the daily grind is real, and it's relentless. Now, about that glamorized view of Egyptian life, let's put it on the chopping block. The idea of lounging around, fanned by palm leaves, is more myth than reality. Your average day involves a lot of sweat and very little glory. Bread may be the stuff of life, but getting it from grain to loaf is a Herculean task. You're part of a crucial cog in the economic machine, and while you might not be building pyramids, you're fueling the folks who are. You, dear baker, are an unsung hero of your time. As the scent of baking bread begins to fill the air, you know your day is just getting started. The sun's climbing higher, and so too is the demand for your bread. But for now, take a moment, breathe in the history around you, and prepare to knead your way through another day in the bustling world of ancient Egypt. It's not just a job, it's a way of life, and you're living it one loaf at a time. Just as you're about to dive into a well-earned moment of appreciation for the aroma wafting through your bakery, the sun reminds you it's time to roll up those sleeves. It's mid-morning in ancient Egypt, and the nitty-gritty of baking is about to begin. You're no stranger to the routine. Let's take a closer look at what really goes into making that life-sustaining staple, bread. First up, let's talk fermentation. Forget your modern-day yeast packets. You're working with sourdough starter, a centuries-old tradition that involves wild yeast and bacteria dancing their microscopic dance in a mix of flour and water. It's a natural fermentation process that makes your dough rise, transforming it from a dense lump to something resembling bread. It's a bit like magic, except it's science and a lot of patience. The fermentation process not only gives your bread its signature tang, but also makes it more digestible. This isn't just a culinary quirk, it's a necessity. Ancient grains like emmer wheat and barley are not exactly gluten-free, but they're definitely gluten-light. This means the long fermentation helps break down the hard-to-digest components, making it easier on the stomachs of your fellow Egyptians. Talk about considerate. Now, let's compare this to modern methods. Today's commercial bakeries might opt for quick-rising yeasts that act faster than a Nile crocodile chasing its lunch. The result? Loaves that are fluffy and light, but miss the complex flavors your ancestors enjoyed. It's like the difference between a symphony and a pop song. Both have their place, but one's got a bit more depth. Speaking of depth, let's dig into archaeology for a moment. Tombs, those time capsules of ancient life, have given us remarkable insights into the world of Egyptian baking. Artistic depictions show bakers like you hard at work, kneading dough and baking loaves under the watchful eyes of the gods. In fact, bread was considered so essential that it was often included in tomb offerings. The dead had to eat too, apparently, and who better to provide than a skilled baker? Archaeologists have unearthed cone-shaped bread molds and clay ovens, revealing the tools of your trade. These relics, preserved for millennia, are a testament to the importance of bread in Egyptian society. But before you start feeling too proud, remember, life as a baker wasn't all about artistic legacy and spiritual significance. It was a grind, both figuratively and literally. The physical demands of your job are no joke. Grinding grain into flour is a task that would make even the most dedicated CrossFit enthusiast wince. Those grinding stones, they weigh about as much as a small elephant. Okay, maybe not quite, but they're heavy enough to turn your muscles into knots. And let's not overlook the health implications. Stone-ground flour often contains tiny bits of grit, a consequence of the grinding process. This means that by the time you're 40, if you're lucky, your teeth are worn down to nubs. Dental plans, not a concept you'll find in ancient Egypt. Let's also debunk the myth of the idyllic Egyptian life. Sure, you've got the pyramids in the background and the Nile in the foreground, but the daily reality is far from glamorous. Long hours spent in the sweltering heat, inhaling flour dust and sweating through your linen tunic take a toll. Forget about ergonomic workspaces or breaks for a leisurely lunch. You've got quotas to meet and loaves to bake. Yet, despite the harsh realities, there's a certain romance to your craft, isn't there? You're not just baking bread, you're sustaining a civilization. Each loaf is a testament to your skill, your endurance, and your contribution to the fabric of society. While pharaohs make the history books, it's people like you who keep the wheels turning. The techniques you use have stood the test of time, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of ancient bakers. And while the world around you may have changed, the essence of bread making remains surprisingly consistent. It's about transformation, taking simple ingredients, and through a blend of artistry and science, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. So here you are, in the thick of it, kneading your way through history. As midday approaches, the demands on your time and energy only increase. But for now, as you prepare another batch of dough, you can take a moment to reflect on the legacy you're crafting one loaf at a time. Sure, your back might ache and your teeth might suffer, but you're part of something bigger, an integral piece of an ancient puzzle, feeding the living and the dead alike. And that, my friend, is nothing short of extraordinary. As the sun reaches its zenith, your bakery transforms into an ancient sauna, minus the relaxation. Sweat trickles down your brow, but there's no time for a break. You've got loaves to bake and a reputation to maintain, because in ancient Egypt, a bad batch of bread is as scandalous as a pyramid scheme. Now, let's dig into the social strata of the bakery world. You might think that as a baker, you're the breadwinner in more ways than one, but hold your horses, or your donkeys in this case. Ancient Egyptian society was as layered as a mill fuel, and your place within it was both crucial and, let's face it, a bit underappreciated. In the hierarchy of trades, bakers were indispensable yet rarely in the spotlight. Pharaohs and priests, they got the monuments and the glory. Bakers, not so much. But make no mistake, bread was the fuel that powered the mighty machine of Egyptian civilization. Without it, even the pharaoh's grandest plans would crumble like stale bread. Within the bakery, there's a pecking order too. You're not a lone artisan kneading dough in solitude. No, you're part of a well-oiled unit, and each member has a role. The master baker, let's call him the CEO of this dough empire, oversees the operation, ensuring quality and efficiency. Then there are the apprentices, the eager young hands learning the craft, possibly dreaming of the day they'll have their own bakery. They're the ones who grind the grains, and if they're lucky, they might one day graduate to mixing dough. It's a classic tale of climbing the corporate ladder, ancient Egyptian style. Now, onto the political theater of bread making. Yes, even in the age of hieroglyphs, bureaucracy was alive and well. The government had its flour-caked fingers in the pie, regulating bread production with an enthusiasm usually reserved for tax collection. Why, you ask? Because bread was a linchpin of the economy. The state wanted to ensure every bite was accounted for, maintaining stability and control. Think of it as an ancient form of quality assurance, albeit with a bit more papyrus than paperwork. This brings us to the delightful absurdities of ancient bureaucracy. Imagine navigating a labyrinth of officials whose job was to ensure your bread met specific standards. Too dense, too light, not enough barley. You'd find yourself answering to a scribe with a checklist and a keen eye for detail. It's like the original health inspection, but with more scrolls and fewer clipboards. The government didn't just regulate bread for fun. It was a strategic move. Bread was a form of currency, and controlling its production meant controlling wealth. It was also a political tool, distributed during festivals, used to pay workers, and offered to the guards. In fact, the state often commandeered bakeries to produce vast quantities for state-sponsored events. It's the ancient equivalent of a government contract, but instead of building roads, you're baking thousands of loaves to feed the masses. And let's not forget the festivals. Bread played a starring role in these communal gatherings, where it was handed out like party favors. Imagine being part of the team responsible for producing the vast quantities needed to keep the party going. The pressure was on, and the stakes were high. Mess up, and you might find yourself on the wrong side of a pharaoh's temper, a place nobody wants to be. Despite the heavy hand of bureaucracy, there was a certain charm to being a baker. You were part of a tradition that stretched back millennia, a living link to the ancestors who first domesticated grains along the Nile. Each loaf you produced was a testament to that enduring legacy. While you might not have statues built in your honor, you had something equally enduring, the satisfaction of knowing you were a vital part of your community's daily life. As you knead another batch of dough, consider the humble yet pivotal role you play. While pharaohs and priests may take the glory, It's your bread that sustains them. Every bite is a reminder of your skill and dedication. In a world obsessed with grandeur, you provide the simple, essential sustenance that holds everything together. It's a role that's both thankless and indispensable, with a touch of romance that only the daily grind of flour and water can bring. So, as the afternoon heat bakes the world outside, you keep working, rolling, and baking. Yours is a craft that, while often overlooked, forms the backbone of society. And though the history books may not sing your praises, the rumbling stomachs of Egypt certainly do. In this bustling world of pyramids and papyrus, you are the unsung hero, feeding a civilization one loaf at a time. But before you get too swept away in the rhythm of your daily grind, let's pivot to the more mystical side of your craft. Because in ancient Egypt, bread wasn't just about carbs and calories. It was a spiritual heavyweight, a sacred offering that was as much about appeasing the gods as it was about feeding the masses. Seriously, bread was the VIP pass to the afterlife, the ultimate gesture of goodwill in religious ceremonies. Here's the deal. Bread in ancient Egypt was like Bitcoin in the early 2010. Everybody wanted a piece, but only a few truly understood its value. Temples weren't just about grand architecture or mysterious hieroglyphs. They were the original all-you-can-eat buffets for the gods. Bread was a top item on the menu, served up in offerings that were more about divine diplomacy than dietary needs. Each loaf represented sustenance for deities, ensuring they kept Egypt's wheels turning smoothly. Now, let's separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to myths. Take Osiris, the god of the afterlife, agriculture, and conveniently, bread. Legend has it that he taught humans how to cultivate grains, a narrative that paints him as the Johnny Appleseed of the ancient world. But does this mean Osiris was a real-life baker or just a mythological influencer? Spoiler alert, the jury's still out. What we do know is that bread was central to rituals honoring Osiris, symbolizing rebirth and life's cyclical nature. And the symbolism doesn't stop there. Bread was also a key player in the opening of the mouth ceremony, a mortuary ritual aimed at reanimating the senses of the deceased. Picture this: priests wielding loaves like magic wands, invoking powers to restore speech and breath to the dead. It's a bit macabre, but hey, who wouldn't want a side of eternal speech with their flatbread? But let's not get too carried away with the mystique. The reality was that bread offerings were as much about politics as they were about piety. Temples functioned as economic hubs, with bread acting as a form of currency to grease the wheels of religious and state activities. It was both a sacred object and a staple, a duality that highlights its importance in Egyptian life. Take the Temple of Karnak, for instance. Archaeological evidence suggests that this colossal complex required over 30,000 loaves daily to keep its rituals, workers, and offerings going. That's a bakery operation that would make even the most seasoned industrial bakeries break a sweat. The economic implications were enormous, employing countless workers and requiring meticulous resource management. Bread, in this context, was the oil that kept the temple's economic engine running. And let's talk artifacts. Bread molds and baking tools found in tombs aren't just relics of culinary history. They are cultural artifacts that speak to the sacredness of bread. Inscriptions and reliefs depict bakers presenting loaves to the gods, as if saying, "Here's a little something from us to keep the universe in balance." It's a gesture that resonates with the deeply ingrained belief that bread was more than food. It was a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Now, as much as we like to romanticize these ancient rituals, let's not forget the gritty realities. Production of ceremonial bread was no mystical endeavor. It was hard labor. Those offerings you see carved in stone, each one was the product of sweat and toil from bakers who probably didn't get a cut of the divine glory. Yet, their contribution was crucial, an unsung yet indispensable part of maintaining cosmic order. And here's another nugget to chew on. Bread wasn't just for the gods or the dearly departed. It played a role in festivals and community gatherings, a social glue that brought people together. Picture the Apit festival, a massive celebration where bread was distributed to the masses as a gesture of goodwill from the pharaoh and the gods. It was a time when the everyday Egyptian could partake in the divine bounty, a rare moment of unity in a stratified society. So as you continue kneading and baking, remember that your loaves are more than sustenance. They are symbols, offerings, and economic tools woven into the very fabric of Egyptian culture. Each loaf is a testament to the intricate dance between the sacred and the mundane, a reminder that even the simplest acts can carry profound significance. In this bustling world of gods, rituals, and hieroglyphs, you stand at the crossroads of history and mythology. You might not have a pyramid with your name on it, but your bread is a legacy in its own right, bridging the gap between the earthly and the eternal. And as the afternoon shadows lengthen, casting a golden hue over your bustling bakery, you can take a moment to appreciate the incredible role you play in this ancient tapestry, one loaf at a time. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty streets of ancient Egypt, you finally get a moment to pause and reflect on a day that's been as relentless as the Nile itself. The evening brings a semblance of relief from the sweltering heat. But let's not kid ourselves. Being an ancient Egyptian baker is no walk in the garden of Osiris. It's more like a marathon, with the finish line moving just a bit further each day. Throughout this journey, we've explored the intricate layers of your world, from the economic bedrock you need and bake each day, to the social hierarchies that dictate who gets to hold the title of Master Baker. It's a life woven into the very fabric of Egyptian society, yet often glossed over in history books that prefer tales of god kings and monumental architecture. But here's the kicker. Without your loaves, those grand narratives would crumble faster than a stale flatbread. Economically speaking, your daily grind is as vital as the sands of the Sahara are to the desert. Bread isn't just a staple, it's a form of currency, a unit of trade that keeps the wheels of commerce turning. It's the ancient equivalent of Bitcoin, but with more substance and definitely more flavor. In a society where actual coins are as rare as a Nile crocodile with a soft side, you're part of a barter system that values your craft as highly as any commodity. Your bread is traded for goods, services, and occasionally a place in the afterlife. It's a system that's simple yet complex, a balancing act between supply and demand that even the most skilled economist would admire. Socially, you've journeyed through a world where bakers are the unsung heroes, part of a crucial cog in the societal machine. While the pharaohs and their priests grab the headlines with their elaborate tombs and divine proclamations, you're the one keeping the masses fed. Sure, you may not have your name etched in stone, but your legacy is written in the hearts and stomachs of those who rely on your bread every day. You're like the stage crew in a grand theater production, essential, yet often overlooked. After all, what good is a stunning set without a show to support it? Culturally, the significance of your work transcends the physical act of baking. Bread is an offering to the gods, a staple in religious ceremonies, and a symbol of life itself. It's as if each loaf is a prayer in flour and water, bridging the gap between the mortal and the divine. But let's not get too carried away by the romance of it all. The reality is that each offering is the result of sweat, toil, and a daily grind that's as eternal as the pyramids themselves. The gods might feast on your bread in the afterlife, but it's your hands that pay the earthly price. Now, let's talk about how modern perceptions of Egypt often get tangled in myths that are more appealing than accurate. We've all seen those glossy depictions of Egyptian life, where everyone lounges by the Nile, draped in linen and gold, living a life of luxury. But the truth is as gritty as the flour dust that coats your bakery. The romanticized image of ancient Egypt often hides the laborious reality. Long hours, back-breaking work, and a life expectancy that's shorter than a pharaoh's temper. It's a world where hard work is the norm, and the only pyramids you're building are stacks of freshly baked loaves. And yet, for all the harsh realities, there's something timeless about the role of the baker. Fast forward to today, and bakers are still the unsung heroes of our daily lives. Sure, the tools have changed. Stone grinders have given way to electric mixers, and clay ovens are now high-tech wonders. But the essence of the craft remains the same. Bread is still a staple, a comfort, and a symbol of community. It's the food that brings people together, whether at a family table or a bustling street market. So, as you wrap up another day of kneading and baking, consider how your ancient craft has evolved, but remains rooted in the same principles. The world has changed, but our love for baked goods has not. From the rustic loaves of ancient Egypt to the artisanal breads of today, there's a continuity that defies the passage of time. In a world that's constantly evolving, bread is the delicious constant, a reminder that some things, like the simple joy of tearing into a warm loaf, never go out of style. In conclusion, while the Pharaohs might have their pyramids, you've got your loaves, and who's to say which legacy will stand the test of time? As the stars begin to twinkle in the Egyptian night, take a moment to savor the aroma of your labors, and the knowledge that, in your own flower-dusted way, you're part of a legacy that spans millennia. You fed a civilization, one loaf at a time, and that, my friend, is a history worth baking into the annals of time. In the days when Rome was more of a scrappy underdog than a sprawling empire, their military tactics were less about sophisticated strategy and more about making do with what they had. Picture a bunch of farmers trading in their plows for spears, hoping to defend their patch of land with the finesse of a toddler wielding a paintbrush. Early Roman military exploits were built on the back of the hoplite warfare model, generously borrowed from their more refined Etruscan neighbors. Yes, the Romans, known for their later military prowess, began their journey by peeking over the Etruscan fence, thinking, well, if it works for them. The Etruscans, those mysterious cousins to the north, had a thing for hoplite warfare. It was all about heavy infantry, a tightly packed phalanx, and a whole lot of hope that nobody would break formation. Now, this wasn't some glamorous Hollywood-style battle scene. It was a grueling grind, more akin to an ancient rugby scrum, but with sharper stakes. The Romans took notes, grabbed their shields, and hoped for the best. And let's be honest, when your military budget is more barley than bullion, you get creative fast. Now, let's talk about the harsh realities of these early Roman soldiers. These weren't professional warriors. They were farmers, artisans, and part-time soldiers. In the Roman kingdom, around the 7th century BC, military service wasn't exactly optional. It was a civic duty, patriotic obligation, if you will, but without the benefits. The equipment, personal expense. Imagine shelling out for armor and weapons when you're barely making ends meet, all while trying to keep your farm from going under. This ragtag bunch didn't have the luxury of a well-funded state armory. The myth of Roman discipline, hold your horses. In these early days, it was more about trial and error, a lot of errors. The Romans weren't the well-oiled military machine yet. They were more like a group of overly enthusiastic amateurs. There was chaos, confusion, and more than a few strategic mishaps. It wasn't pretty, but it was theirs. And every victory, no matter how small, was a step toward the iron discipline they would later be famous for. Economic constraints were a constant companion. Rome's early economy wasn't built on the spoils of war, but rather on agriculture and trade. The city's treasury wasn't overflowing with gold, but rather with IOUs and the occasional livestock exchange. This financial tightrope walk forced the Romans to innovate out of sheer necessity. They couldn't afford to lose battles. Each skirmish was a potential existential crisis. Let's give credit where it's due. The Romans were nothing if not adaptive. They learned from every defeat, every embarrassing retreat, and every Etruscan maneuver they witnessed. It was this ability to learn, to evolve, that set the stage for the later military juggernaut Rome would become. But in these early days, it was all about survival, scraping by, and making the best of borrowed tactics and hand-me-down armor. So, next time someone waxes lyrical about the legendary discipline of Roman legions, remind them of the early days. The days when discipline was more of a suggestion than a rule, and innovation was born out of the sheer necessity of keeping the wolves, or rather, the neighbors, from the door. It's a testament to the Roman spirit that from such humble, chaotic beginnings, an empire would rise. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's acknowledge that Rome's military evolution started not with a bang, but with a somewhat awkward shuffle onto the stage of history. Now, having shuffled their way onto the stage of history, the Romans were about to get a crash course in the school of hard knocks, courtesy of the Gauls. Picture the scene. It's 390 BC, and Rome is about to experience a wake-up call that makes your Monday morning alarm seem like a lullaby. Enter the Gallic sack of Rome, a disaster wrapped in chaos, topped off with a side of humiliation. As the story goes, the Gauls, led by the charismatic Brennus, waltzed into Rome like they owned the place. Why? Because at that moment, they pretty much did. The Romans, caught with their togas down, faced the harsh reality that their military strategy was as outdated as a Betamax tape in a Blu-ray world. The Gallic warriors, with their wild, unkempt hair and battle cries that could wake the dead, showed the Romans that their hoplite-style phalanx was about as effective as a chocolate teapot in the sweltering Italian sun. The rigid formations were no match for the fluid, unpredictable tactics of the Gauls, who didn't play by the rules, or any rules, really. But let's not kick them while they're down. Out of this chaos emerged a silver lining, a man named Marcus Furius Camillus. This guy was the kind of leader who could inspire confidence in a sinking ship. Camillus, seeing the writing on the wall, probably scribbled there by a passing Gaul, realized that Rome's military needed an overhaul, and fast. The Romans, no strangers to borrowing ideas, decided to adapt the manipular formation. Think of it as the Swiss army knife of military tactics. Versatile, adaptable, and much more effective than their previous approach. The manipular formation was revolutionary for its time, dividing the army into smaller, more flexible units called maniples. Each maniple was like a self-contained team, capable of moving independently, yet still part of the larger whole. This setup allowed for a degree of mobility and adaptability that made the previous phalanx formations look like a lumbering dinosaur. The Roman army could now respond to threats on the fly, adjusting their tactics mid-battle rather than sticking rigidly to a pre-planned script. Camillus didn't stop there. He also restructured the army into a more cohesive force, with a hierarchy that made sense and a command system that ensured orders weren't just suggestions. Under his watchful eye, the Roman military began to morph into the disciplined machine that would eventually dominate the ancient world. It was as much about political savvy as battlefield brilliance. Camillus knew that to lead effectively, he needed the backing of Rome's political elite. And he played that game like a maestro, ensuring that every military victory was also a political win, further cementing his legacy. The economic context of these changes is crucial, too. Rome, still recovering from the Gallic sack, couldn't afford costly mistakes. Every soldier was an investment, and Camillus knew that the new system had to be cost-effective and sustainable. The manipular formation allowed for a more efficient use of resources, both in terms of manpower and equipment. Soldiers were now better equipped to face varied threats, from the rolling hills of Italy to the distant shores they would later conquer. But let's not romanticize too much. This transition was neither smooth nor universally accepted. There were plenty of traditionalists who balked at the changes, clinging to the old ways like a drowning man to a leaky lifeboat. Camillus faced resistance, political infighting, and the ever-present threat of external enemies eager to exploit any sign of weakness. Yet, through a combination of sheer willpower and strategic finesse, he pushed through the reforms that would set the stage for Rome's rise to power. The manipular system wasn't just a military tactic. It was a reflection of the Roman ethos, a society built on adaptability, pragmatism, and an unyielding desire to survive and thrive. It's a myth that Rome was always destined for greatness. In reality, it was these moments of crisis, these instances of being knocked down and getting back up, that forged the Rome we read about today. The manipular formation was just the beginning, a symbol of a military and a society learning to roll with the punches and come back swinging. So, while the story of Rome's military evolution is often told with a sheen of inevitability, the truth is far more complex. It's a tale of trial and error, of brilliant minds like Camillus who saw opportunity in disaster, and of a society that refused to let a little thing like a city sacking get in the way of their ambitions. And while the Romans may have started as a gaggle of farmers with more pluck than prowess, they were fast becoming a force to be reckoned with. The legend of the Roman legion was being written, one adaptive maneuver at a time. But as they say, the best stories are yet to come. Stay tuned. As Rome flexed its newly muscled military might, the stage was set for a seismic shift that would turn the Roman legions from an eager apprentice into the star pupil of ancient warfare. Enter Gaius Marius, the man who looked at Rome's military like a fixer-upper home, saw the potential, and decided it was demo day. Marius was a Roman general and statesman who, in 107 BC, became the architect of what we now call the Marian reforms. And let me tell you, these changes were as sweeping as a reality show home makeover, but with more armor and fewer throw pillows. Before Marius, the Roman army was like an exclusive club. Only property-owning citizens could enlist, with the idea being that if you had skin in the game, literally land, you'd fight harder to protect it. But Marius eyed Rome's swelling population of landless citizens, the Capite Censi, and thought, why not draft them into the legions? Sure, they didn't have property, but what they lacked in land they made up for an enthusiasm. Plus, they were already in the city, hanging out with nothing to do. Marius saw a resource waiting to be tapped and figured, why not turn these idle hands into Rome's next military powerhouse? This wasn't just a military recruitment drive, it was a social revolution. By allowing the Capite Censi to enlist, Marius essentially told the Roman elite, hey, your exclusive war club is now open to everyone. Cue the patrician pearl clutching. But here's the kicker. Marius also promised these new recruits land as a retirement bonus, effectively turning military service into a full-time job with benefits. In economic terms, he transformed the legions from a seasonal gig economy into a professional standing army. Talk about an ancient jobs program. The immediate effect. Rome's army swelled with eager new soldiers, not just fighting to protect Rome, but also for the promise of a secure future. And while that sounds like a win-win, it also meant that these soldiers' loyalties began to shift. No longer were they just fighting for the glory of the Republic. They were fighting for their general, the guy promising them a plot of land and a chance at stability. It was like a military version of The Apprentice, with generals as the charismatic CEOs and soldiers vying for that coveted post-war real estate. But don't let the romantic notion of upward mobility fool you. This was about power. Plain and simple. The Roman state had a new set of problems. Generals with armies more loyal to them than to the Senate. And this is where our corporate merger metaphor really kicks in. Imagine a massive corporate takeover where the CEOs, our generals, wielded more influence than the board of directors, our Roman Senate. It was a recipe for political upheaval, and Gaius Marius was the chef who threw in the spice. Now, let's hit the pause button on the melodrama and look at the nuts and bolts. The Marian reforms also standardized military equipment, because let's face it, a ragtag army with mismatched gear is about as effective as a Swiss cheese umbrella. Marius introduced the pilum, a throwing spear designed to bend upon impact, making it unusable by the enemy. Genius, right? These reforms made the Roman legions not just larger, but also more versatile and deadly. Picture an army that now moved like a well-rehearsed dance troupe, each soldier equipped with identical gear, from the gladius to the iconic rectangular scutum shield. It was as much about branding as it was about functionality. But the economic implications were as significant as the tactical ones. With the state funding soldiers, buying their equipment, and promising post-service land, the financial burden shifted. In a sense, Rome was investing in its military as if buying stock in a future empire. The Senate had to keep up with the growing demand for resources, from food supplies to new settlements, to fulfill the land promises made to veterans. It was a logistical puzzle that Marius and his successors had to solve, balancing the books while keeping the legions and their new expectations in check. And oh, the political waves these reforms created. The Senate, not exactly thrilled about having generals with armies ready to march at their personal behest, found itself in a precarious position. The lines between military and political power were blurring faster than a watercolor in the rain. Marius himself would ride this wave of reform to political heights, serving as consul an unprecedented 7 times. It's no wonder that the Roman political landscape of the late Republic began to resemble a high-stakes game of musical chairs, with everyone vying for a seat before the music stopped and the knives came out. In the end, Marius's reforms weren't just about making the Roman army bigger and badder. They were about reshaping the very foundations of Roman society and politics. The Republic was entering a new era, one where the sword and the olive branch were wielded in tandem, and where the ambitions of men like Marius would lay the groundwork for the eventual rise of emperors. But that's a story for later. For now, let's just appreciate the audacity of Marius's vision. A man who took a motley crew of landless citizens and transformed them into a fighting force that would echo through history. So, while it may look like Marius simply threw open the doors of the Roman army to anyone with a pulse, the reality was much more nuanced. He was a strategist who saw opportunity in chaos, a leader who understood that to control an empire, you needed more than just soldiers. You needed loyalty. And in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, that kind of loyalty was worth its weight in gold, or in this case, land. As we leave the Marian reforms in the rearview, remember this was just the beginning of Rome's transformation. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the drama was far from over. Stay tuned, because the next act in Rome's military evolution is about to unfold. As the dust settled on the Marian reforms, Rome was on the cusp of yet another transformation, this time under the watchful eye of Augustus. You see, Augustus wasn't about to let the chaos of the late Republic repeat itself. He was more like a CEO brought in to stabilize a floundering company, except his company was an empire, and his board meetings involved legions rather than PowerPoint slides. Picture Augustus standing over a sprawling map of the Roman world, a world that now stretched from the windswept shores of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. Managing such an empire was like trying to herd cats with a feather duster. The key: stability and a permanent military presence that wouldn't just defend, but also embody Roman power. Enter the permanent legions, Augustus's brainchild and Rome's answer to the logistical headache of managing distant provinces. Augustus understood that to keep this overgrown beast of an empire from unraveling, he needed a military that was as reliable as it was formidable. The legions became a standing army, garrisoned across the empire. These new permanent units were set up in strategic locations, acting like a network of Roman franchises. Think of them as ancient branch offices, each one ready to enforce the emperor's will and collect the empire's dues. Now, let's talk standardization. Augustus wasn't just content with having any old army. He wanted the Roman military to look as uniform as a well-practiced marching band. Equipment was standardized across the legions, every soldier wielding a gladius, sporting a scudum, and tossing a pilum with military precision. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about efficiency. Mass production of weapons and armor meant supply lines could be streamlined, reducing costs and ensuring that every legionary was ready to rumble at a moment's notice. But funding this military machine was no small feat. Augustus wasn't exactly sitting on a dragon's hoard of gold. The empire had vast resources, sure, but keeping the legions fed, armed, and loyal was a financial juggling act. Enter the Aerarium Militaire, a military treasury established in 6 AD to secure funds for soldiers' salaries and retirement benefits. Augustus cleverly used taxes and provincial tributes to fill this war chest, ensuring the legions were both well paid and, crucially, loyal to him. It was a financial sleight of hand that made Augustus the master of both empire and economy. Of course, Augustus had to keep the Senate happy, or at least placated. He positioned himself as the first among equals, a title that was about as humble as a peacock claiming to be just another bird. The truth was, Augustus wielded more power than any senator dared to dream, but he let them keep their titles and their illusions of influence. In return, they supported his military reforms, understanding that the legions were the backbone of Rome's might and their own cushy lifestyles. Yet, despite the iron discipline and sleek organization, the Roman military under Augustus wasn't the invincible juggernaut often romanticized in tales of conquest. Managing campaigns across the empire's vast domains was a logistical nightmare. Picture the supply lines stretching across deserts, mountains, and seas, vulnerable at every turn to weather, rebellion, and the occasional band of opportunistic brigands. The legions might have been disciplined, but they were also human, prone to hunger, fatigue, and disease. The myth of Roman invincibility. It was a marketing campaign, a story told to keep provinces in line and enemies at bay. The reality was far grittier. Every campaign was a chess match, with generals like Augustus himself orchestrating movements across the board, balancing supply and demand, morale and strategy. The legions were a formidable force, no doubt, but they were also an expensive one. The cost of maintaining this military machine was a constant pressure on the Roman economy, a factor that would eventually contribute to the empire's financial woes. And let's not forget the political acrobatics required to keep the legions loyal. Augustus was acutely aware of the danger posed by ambitious generals with their own armies. He saw the chaos of the late Republic, where soldiers' allegiances shifted like the tides, and he wasn't about to let history repeat itself. By ensuring soldiers were paid directly by the state, not their generals, Augustus kept their loyalty firmly anchored to Rome, and by extension to himself. But Augustus's reforms weren't just about keeping the peace. They were about projecting power, about making sure that when Rome spoke, the world listened. The permanent legions were a symbol of Roman might, a reminder to both friend and foe that Rome was here to stay. Yet, even as Augustus solidified his legacy, he couldn't escape the long shadow of the future. The empire would face new challenges, new enemies, and new leaders who would test the very foundations he had laid. So, while Augustus's reign marked a high point in Roman military prowess, it was also a precarious balancing act. The legions were a double-edged sword, their loyalty both a boon and a potential threat. The empire was vast, its resources plentiful, but the cost of maintaining Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was steep. Augustus may have been the architect of a new Roman world, but the empire he helped build would soon face trials that even he couldn't foresee. Stage was set for the next chapter, one where Rome's military machine would be put to the test in ways that would echo through the ages. Stay tuned, because the curtain is far from falling on this epic saga. While Augustus had orchestrated a symphony of stability, the harmony of Rome's military machine would eventually hit some sour notes. You see, the empire's expansion was like a kid at a candy store, eyes bigger than its stomach. By the time we hit the 3rd century AD, Rome was stretched thinner than a catwalk model on a diet, and the cracks were starting to show. First off, let's talk about the economy, or rather, the slow-motion train wreck that it became. Rome's economy was the lifeblood of its military might, a complex web of agriculture, trade, and taxes. But as the empire ballooned, so did its expenses. Keeping legions stationed from the British Isles to the sands of Arabia was no cheap feat. Financial burden was like a leaky bucket. No matter how much you poured in, it was never enough. Inflation soared like a chariot on a downhill race, with the silver content of coins dropping faster than a politician's promises. By the late empire, a denarius wasn't worth the metal it was minted on. Political corruption didn't help matters, either. Rome's leadership began to resemble a reality TV show, with emperors coming and going faster than you can say, et tu, brute. The infamous year of the 5 emperors in 193 AD was just a warm-up act. The real circus arrived during the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period where the empire went through a whopping 26 emperors, give or take a few who didn't last long enough to get their busts carved. Each one was eager to outdo the last, often vying for power with the help of their own personal legions. The military had become kingmakers, and Rome was paying the price. Overextension was the name of the game. The Roman legions were like a stretched rubber band, and we all know what happens when you stretch too far. The frontiers were under constant pressure from barbarian tribes who saw Rome's wealth as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The Goths, Vandals, and Huns weren't just knocking on the door. They were kicking it down with the enthusiasm of over-caffeinated party crashers. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD was a wake-up call that hit Rome harder than a gladiator's left hook. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and it showed the world that the legions weren't the indomitable force they once were. Rome's solution, more soldiers, but with an economy that was more bust than boom, paying for them was a Herculean task. The empire turned to mercenaries, foreign soldiers who fought for gold, not glory. These guys were the ancient equivalent of freelancers, and while they bolstered the ranks, their loyalty was as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. When push came to shove, they'd switch sides faster than you could say double agent. Now, let's debunk a myth while we're at it. The myth of the eternal Roman army, forever undefeated. The truth is, military supremacy is like a sandcastle at high tide, impressive at first, but inevitably eroded by time and tide. Rome's military machine was a marvel, but it was built on the shifting sands of human ambition and economic reality. The allure of invincibility was a story told to keep enemies at bay and citizens in line, but reality was a harsher teacher. As we inch closer to the fall of Rome, it's essential to grasp why these factors mattered. The military was Rome's backbone, its enforcer, and its ambassador to the world. When the backbone faltered, so did the empire. The decline wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, painful unraveling. Economic strain, political corruption, and military overreach created a perfect storm that even Rome's legendary resilience couldn't weather forever. So, what can we learn from this ancient tale? Well, if history teaches us anything, it's that even the mightiest of empires can stumble under their own weight. Rome's military was a symbol of power, but it was also a reflection of the empire's strengths and weaknesses. The myths of Roman invincibility endure, fueled by tales of conquest and glory, but the reality is a sobering reminder of human frailty and the limits of power. As the curtains close on our exploration of Rome's military evolution, let's take a moment to appreciate the full picture. From its humble beginnings as a ragtag militia to its zenith as a world-conquering juggernaut, the Roman army was a force of nature. But like all forces, it was subject to the same laws that govern us all: time, change, and the inevitability of decline. The legacy of Rome's military isn't just one of battles and conquests. It's a testament to the complexity of human ambition and the impermanence of power. And so, as we bid farewell to the legions and their storied past, let's remember that history is more than just dates and names. It's a tapestry of triumphs and trials, myths and realities. Rome's military might may have faded, but its lessons remain, echoing through the corridors of time, reminding us that even the greatest stories have an end. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where the air is as thin as the patience of a bureaucrat, a young prince named Menelik was about to embark on a journey that would make the best political thriller look like a bedtime story. Born in 1844, Sal Meriam, as he was originally called, was no ordinary child. He was the grandson of the mighty King Sal Selassie of Shua, a small kingdom within Ethiopia. From the get-go, Menelik seemed destined for more than just a life of royal monotony. Now, Menelik's early years could easily be mistaken for a chapter out of Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, of course. When he was a mere 11 years old, he was captured by Emperor Tuadros Roman II. This was a classic case of keep your enemies close, with Tuadros hoping to get a tighter grip on the Shuan region by holding its prince. So off Menelik went to the imperial court, probably grumbling about the lack of Wi-Fi and snacks for the journey. But instead of sulking in captivity, Menelik used this time to observe and learn the ropes of leadership from the inside. He watched Tuadros' every move like a hawk, or maybe more like a particularly sharp-eyed crow, absorbing both the emperor's strengths and his glaring weaknesses. This was a kid who understood that knowing the enemy was half the battle, and he took notes, mental notes, since notebooks weren't exactly a thing back then. Fast forward to the ripe old age of 21, and Menelik managed to escape from Tuadros' hold. How did he do it? With a dash of daring and a sprinkle of cunning, he slipped away from his captors and made his way back to Shua. If there were Oscars for dramatic returns, Menelik would have swept the awards. He was greeted not just as a returning prince, but as a symbol of hope for those tired of Tuadros' heavy hand. It wasn't long before Menelik assumed the throne of Shua, donning the crown like it was made for him. Because, well, it was. Menelik's early reign was all about playing chess while others were stuck on checkers. He knew that his kingdom was a geopolitical hot potato, sandwiched between rival factions and foreign interests. So what did Menelik do? He played the diplomatic field like a maestro, orchestrating alliances that would cement his power. He married Bafana, daughter of a key ally, and thus secured a bond that was more valuable than gold. Though let's be honest, gold is pretty valuable too. And speaking of gold, Menelik was not one to be starry-eyed about royal grandeur. He was pragmatic, understanding that his kingdom needed more than just a shiny crown to thrive. It needed roads, schools, and a modernized army. But first, Menelik had to deal with the small matter of keeping his throne amidst the swirling storm of Ethiopian politics. One of his notable feats of trickery came during his rivalry with Emperor Johannes Roman IV. Menelik, in a move that would make any Khan artist proud, forged a letter supposedly from the British promising support against Johannes. This fake letter was a strategic masterstroke. Think of it as the 19th century version of a deepfake. It sowed just enough confusion and doubt to buy Menelik some precious time, allowing him to consolidate power in Shua and beyond. But Menelik's wit wasn't just for political machinations. He also had a sense of humor that seemed almost modern. There's a story of a foreign dignitary visiting his court, who, upon seeing Menelik's prized elephant, asked what the creature was used for. Menelik reportedly replied with a straight face, "Why, it's for carrying my thoughts." It's this kind of sharp, understated humor that made Menelik not only a formidable leader, but also a man who could disarm with a smile. By the late 19th century, Menelik was no longer just a regional power player. He was a king with ambitions that stretched across Ethiopia. It was a country on the brink of transformation, caught between the old ways and the looming shadow of colonial interests. The Italians were sniffing around like hungry dogs, eyeing Ethiopia as a potential jewel in their imperial crown. But Menelik had other plans. He was determined to modernize Ethiopia on his own terms, not as a pawn of European powers. As Menelik stood on the cusp of becoming Emperor of Ethiopia, he was acutely aware that his next moves would shape not only his destiny, but the future of his nation. His rise was not just a tale of personal ambition, but a testament to his strategic brilliance and his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of politics with wit and wisdom. The stage was set, the players were in place, and Menelik was ready to take Ethiopia into a new era, one bold step at a time. Menelik, Roman II, now poised to take the helm of an entire nation, wasn't content to just sit on his laurels, or his throne for that matter. With a vision as vast as the Ethiopian highlands, he set about dragging his country into the modern age, kicking and screaming if necessary. His first order of business, the telegraph. Imagine, for a moment, the collective gasp of an Ethiopian court when Menelik introduced this newfangled contraption. It was like telling them the earth was round. Shock, disbelief, maybe a touch of existential crisis. Now, Menelik wasn't exactly a tech nerd, but he grasped the potential of this talking wire, faster than you can say, electromagnetic field. By 1889, the telegraph was snaking its way from Addis Ababa to Harare, a distance of about 550 kilometers. This wasn't just about exchanging pleasantries faster than a horseback rider. It was a strategic move to keep his finger on the pulse of a sprawling nation. In a land where news traveled slower than a tortoise in a marathon, the telegraph was nothing short of revolutionary. But let's not sugarcoat it. The introduction of telegraph lines wasn't all smooth sailing. Picture the bewilderment of the local populace. Here were these mysterious wires, sprouting up like alien tendrils across their fields. The locals were skeptical, to put it mildly. Rumor had it that the wires were instruments of witchcraft, or maybe some bizarre Italian plot. In fact, some locals took a page from the book of how to deal with the unknown and simply snipped them, thinking it would stop the sorcery in its tracks. But Menelik, with his trademark humor, reportedly quipped that the telegraph was indeed magic, just the kind of magic that made messages travel faster than any spell. Next on Menelik's modernization checklist was the railway. Ah, railway, an emblem of progress and the bane of traditionalists everywhere. It was the late 1800, and European powers were laying down tracks faster than you could say colonial ambition. Menelik, however, was determined that this iron horse would be ridden on Ethiopia's terms. The railway linking Addis Ababa to Djibouti was a colossal undertaking, stretching over 750 kilometers. It was a project that required not just vision, but cold, hard cash, an estimated 40 million francs to be exact. And that's 19th century francs, which, adjusted for inflation, could probably buy you a small country today. The economic impact was monumental. The railway didn't just transport goods, it transported Ethiopia into the 20th century. It opened up trade routes, reduced transportation costs, and connected the interior to the coast, making it easier for Ethiopia to export its coffee, the lifeblood of many a sleep-deprived student today. But the cultural clash was real. For many Ethiopians, the sight of a steaming locomotive was as foreign as a UFO landing in their backyard. There were whispers that the railway was a channel for foreign devils, or worse, a tool to steal Ethiopian souls and ship them to Europe. Menelik, ever the diplomat, reassured his people with a twinkle in his eye, saying, if the Europeans want our souls, they'll have to catch them first. Despite the skeptics, Menelik's modernization efforts set Ethiopia on a path toward economic resilience. By 1900, the nation was exporting an impressive 4,000 tons of coffee annually, with revenues feeding back into infrastructure projects. It was a virtuous cycle, or as virtuous as cycles get in the cutthroat world of global trade. Menelik's vision was clear, an Ethiopia that stood on its own 2 feet, unbowed and unbroken by foreign powers. Yet not everything was as idyllic as a postcard from paradise. The modernization drive faced its own set of hurdles. For one, Menelik had to juggle the interests of various ethnic groups, each with its own stake in the nation's future. The Amharas, Oromos, Tigrayans, and others weren't exactly singing kumbaya around the campfire. Menelik had to balance modernization with tradition, ensuring that progress didn't bulldoze cultural identities like a runaway train. Still, Menelik was nothing if not clever. He employed a policy of calculated compromise, appeasing local chiefs with titles and lands while keeping the modernization train chugging along. It was a balancing act worthy of an Olympic gymnast, and Menelik performed it with style. This was not just about laying down tracks and stringing up wires. It was about knitting together a nation through the threads of progress. And let's talk about Menelik's personal touch, a leader who didn't just rule from a distance, but engaged directly with his people. In one charming anecdote, when presented with an early automobile, Menelik reportedly asked, "Does it eat grass?" When assured it did not, he quipped, "Then it's of no use to me." Yet, he quickly saw the potential of these horseless carriages, and soon had a small fleet for official use, much to the amusement and awe of his subjects. Menelik's modernization efforts were not just about economic growth, but about crafting a national identity that could withstand the pressures of colonialism. This wasn't modernization for modernization's sake. It was a strategic gambit to ensure Ethiopia's sovereignty in a world increasingly dominated by imperial powers. Menelik was acutely aware that the winds of change were blowing across Africa, and he was determined that Ethiopia would not be swept away. So, there you have it. A leader with a vision as sharp as his wit, determined to drag his nation into the modern age, whether it liked it or not. Menelik Roman II wasn't just a ruler. He was a modernizer, a strategist, and a man with a twinkle in his eye that said, "Just watch me." The stage was set for a new era in Ethiopian history, one that would see the nation navigate the choppy waters of the 20th century with a steady hand and an unyielding spirit. But as they say, every silver lining has a cloud, and Menelik's story was far from over. But Menelik's tale was far from over, and the real drama was just warming up. Now, let's pivot to a time when Ethiopia was about to play a high-stakes poker game with the European powers, with Menelik holding a royal flush while others were bluffing with pairs. Into the late 19th century, a time when European powers were carving up Africa like a Thanksgiving turkey. The Italians, in their quest for a colonial empire, had their eyes set on Ethiopia. They had this grand vision of an Italian East Africa, complete with terracotta rooftops and pasta al dente. But Menelik had no intention of being the garnish on Italy's imperial plate. The Treaty of Wuchale in 1889 was supposed to be a friendly agreement between Menelik and the Italians. But as always, the devil was in the details, or rather, the devil was in the translation. The Amharic version of the treaty stated that Menelik could use Italy's help if he wanted, like a neighbor lending a cup of sugar. However, the Italian version cheekily implied that Menelik was required to seek Italy's approval for foreign relations, essentially making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. Talk about lost in translation, right? It was like ordering a pizza and getting a calzone instead. Menelik, no fool and definitely no pushover, wasn't having any of it. Once he realized the Italians were trying to sneakily put Ethiopia under their colonial thumb, he tore up the treaty faster than a breakup note. This diplomatic snafu set the stage for one of history's most underrated showdowns, the Battle of Adwa in 1896. The Battle of Adwa, a tale of grit, strategy, and a touch of divine intervention if you ask some Ethiopians. Menelik's forces were up against a modern European army, and on paper, it looked like a foregone conclusion. The Italians had machine guns, artillery, and all the trappings of a 19th century military juggernaut. But Menelik had home field advantage, an intimate knowledge of the terrain, and a knack for strategy that would make a chess grandmaster nod in approval. On March 1, 1896, the two armies clashed in the mountainous terrain of Adwa. Menelik had around 100,000 troops, a mix of warriors from all over Ethiopia, Amharas, Oromos, Tigrayans, you name it. The Italians, on the other hand, had approximately 17,000 soldiers, feeling confident, perhaps a little too much so. They underestimated their opponent, a classic case of hubris meeting its nemesis. Menelik orchestrated his army like a maestro commanding an orchestra, using the landscape to his advantage. He divided his forces strategically, setting up ambushes and cutting off Italian supply lines. In a move that proved pivotal, Menelik's wife, Empress Tedu Batul, led a contingent of troops herself, proving she was as formidable as she was regal. The Italians, caught off guard by Ethiopia's fierce resistance and tactical prowess, were thrown into disarray. The Ethiopian forces swarmed down upon them with a ferocity born of defending their homeland. By the end of the day, the Italian army was in tatters, suffering around 7,000 casualties, while Ethiopian losses were significantly lower, though still costly. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a monumental moment in history, a David and Goliath story with a twist. Ethiopia had not only defended its sovereignty, but had also sent a clear message to the world. They weren't anyone's colonial conquest. Now, let's bust some myths while we're at it. The victory at Adwa wasn't just a stroke of luck or divine intervention. It was the result of careful planning, strategic alliances, and the sheer will of the Ethiopian people. Menelik's ability to unify diverse ethnic groups under one banner was a testament to his diplomatic skills. This wasn't just a battle for land. It was a battle for identity, for the right to self-determine. And it resonated far beyond the borders of Ethiopia, inspiring anti-colonial movements across Africa. It was a rallying cry that said, "We are here, and we will not be moved." The aftermath of Adwa was as significant as the battle itself. Italy was left licking its wounds, forced to recognize Ethiopia's full independence in the Treaty of Addis Ababa. Menelik, ever the savvy statesman, capitalized on this victory to strengthen his position both domestically and internationally. He established diplomatic relations with major world powers, ensuring Ethiopia's place on the world stage as a sovereign nation, not just a footnote in someone else's history book. Menelik's diplomatic prowess didn't stop there. He negotiated with European powers like a master chess player, knowing when to make a move and when to hold back. He played the French against the British, the Russians against the Italians, ensuring that Ethiopia remained a neutral player in the great game of imperial geopolitics. It was a balancing act that would make a trapeze artist sweat, yet Menelik managed it with elegance and precision. But let's not gloss over the economic realities that came with this newfound recognition. Menelik understood that a victory in battle needed to be followed by economic strength. He knew that Ethiopia's future lay not just in its ability to fend off invaders, but in its capacity to thrive in a rapidly modernizing world. His focus on infrastructure, like expanding the telegraph and railway systems, was part of a broader strategy to integrate Ethiopia into the global economy, ensuring it wasn't just independent, but prosperous. And so, as Menelik stood surveying his kingdom, he knew that the battle for Ethiopia's soul was far from over. The forces of modernization and tradition were still at play, each with its own demands and its own vision for the future. But Menelik wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. With the memory of Adwa fresh in his mind and the future of Ethiopia in his hands, he continued his journey, one bold step at a time. The story of Menelik Roman II was not just one of battles and treaties. It was a narrative of resilience, ingenuity, and an unyielding spirit that refused to be conquered. As the chapter of Adwa closed, another was just beginning, and there was much more to come. And so, while the echoes of victory at Adwa still reverberated through the Ethiopian highlands, Menelik Roman II turned his gaze inward, toward the complex tapestry of his own kingdom. Winning against the Italians had been a spectacular feat, but now Menelik faced a different kind of battlefield, one filled with the age-old specters of regional uprisings and palace intrigues. You see, governing Ethiopia was like playing a game of three-dimensional chess, only with more pieces and fewer rules. First up on Menelik's list of challenges were the regional nobles, each with their own little fiefdoms and aspirations. Ethiopia was a patchwork quilt of ethnicities and allegiances, and Menelik had to keep it all stitched together without dropping a stitch. The Oromo, Amhara, Tigray, and countless other groups each had their own cultures and interests. It was like trying to herd cats, except these cats had swords and a penchant for rebellion. One noble uprising was in the Garjam region, where Ras Mengesha Adaikum decided he fancied a bit more autonomy than Menelik was willing to grant. Mengesha, like many regional leaders, saw himself not just as a subordinate, but as a ruler in his own right. Menelik, not one to let a good crisis go to waste, handled the situation with his usual mix of tact and humor. He famously quipped, "A kingdom divided against itself will be conquered by its own confusion." It was a reminder that unity was a stronger weapon than any sword. And then There was the matter of the Shuan nobility, who were not exactly lining up to sing Menelik's praises. The Shuan nobles had grown used to a certain level of independence, and Menelik's centralizing policies were about as welcome as a rainstorm at a picnic. But Menelik, with his cunning and charisma, knew that bending was sometimes better than breaking. He extended olive branches disguised as official titles and land grants, turning potential adversaries into allies. Menelik's balancing act didn't stop at politics. He was also a master at juggling tradition with the winds of modernization. While he pushed Ethiopia into the 20th century with one hand, he held firmly onto its rich traditions with the other. But navigating this duality wasn't always a walk in the park. It was more like a tightrope walk over a pit of hungry lions. Menelik's efforts to introduce modern education were met with skepticism from traditionalists who feared that Western ideas would erode Ethiopian culture. He had to convince them that knowledge was power, not a Trojan horse carrying cultural dilution. And speaking of power, Menelik had his own palace intrigues to deal with, because what's an emperor's court without a little drama? The Ethiopian court was a hotbed of scheming and plotting, where loyalties shifted like sands in the desert. Menelik's knack for humor and cunning came in handy here. He once joked, "If you want to know who your friends are, let them run your bath when you're not looking." His ability to laugh in the face of treachery was a testament to his resilience and his understanding that sometimes the best armor is a thick skin. But not all of Menelik's efforts were met with applause and fanfare. His modernization strategies occasionally stumbled, like a toddler learning to walk. Take, for instance, his attempts to introduce a modern tax system. The idea was simple: replace the age-old tribute system with a more standardized tax regime. But the execution was about as smooth as sandpaper. Many local rulers resisted, seeing it as an infringement on their established privileges. Menelik learned the hard way that changing centuries-old traditions was like trying to teach an old dog new tricks, passable, but fraught with barking and the occasional bite. Despite these challenges, Menelik's charm and diplomatic finesse often saved the day. He was a master of the art of the deal before it was even a thing. His negotiations with foreign powers were legendary, and his ability to balance competing interests was nothing short of magical. Menelik's diplomatic charm was not just about smiling and waving. It was about understanding the desires and fears of those he dealt with, and using that knowledge to Ethiopia's advantage. Yet, Menelik was not infallible. His occasional missteps were reminders that even the greatest leaders can trip over their own ambitions. One such blunder involved the importation of rifles from the French, which didn't quite go as planned. The shipment was delayed due to bureaucratic red tape, leaving Menelik's army momentarily under-equipped. This hiccup in his armament strategy was a sobering lesson in the unpredictability of international dealings. And then there was the matter of his successor. Menelik's health was declining, and the question of who would follow him on the throne was a subject of much debate and, naturally, intrigue. His nephew, Iyasu, was named as the heir, but Iyasu's youth and inexperience raised eyebrows faster than a rumor in a small town. The court was abuzz with whispers, and Menelik had to navigate this delicate issue with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Through it all, Menelik's legacy was being forged not just in battles and treaties, but in the everyday struggles of leadership. He was crafting a nation from the inside out, using humor as a tool, not a crutch, and wielding cunning like a sculptor with a chisel. Menelik Roman II reign was a testament to the power of resilience and the art of balancing on the edge of a knife. As the sun set on another day in Menelik's Ethiopia, the challenges remained as formidable as ever, yet the path forward was as clear as the blue skies over Addis Ababa. Menelik knew that the heart of his nation beat not just in its victories, but in its ability to adapt and endure. And so, with a twinkle in his eye and a steely resolve, he continued to write the next chapter of Ethiopia's story, one strategic move at a time. The saga was far from over, and the best, as they say, was yet to come. As the sun set on another day in Menelik's Ethiopia, the challenges remained formidable, yet the path forward was as clear as the blue skies over Addis Ababa. Menelik knew that the heart of his nation beat not just in its victories, but in its ability to adapt and endure. And so, with a twinkle in his eye and a steely resolve, he continued to write the next chapter of Ethiopia's story, one strategic move at a time. The saga was far from over, and the best, as they say, was yet to come. Fast forward to the end of his reign, and Menelik Roman II had woven a legacy as intricate as an Ethiopian tapestry. By the time he passed away in 1913, Menelik had left a mark that rippled far beyond the boundaries of Ethiopia, reaching into the heart of Africa and beyond. His reign was a masterclass in balancing modernization with tradition, a tightrope walk he executed with the grace of a seasoned acrobat. Menelik's modernization initiatives weren't just about shiny new toys like telegraphs and railroads. They were about creating a robust infrastructure that could withstand the pressures of both internal and external forces. By the dawn of the 20th century, Menelik had managed to connect Addis Ababa to the world, not just through trade, but through diplomacy, establishing embassies and consulates across Europe and the Middle East. This was not merely for show. It was a strategic play to ensure that Ethiopia wasn't isolated in a rapidly globalizing world. However, let's not get carried away by the romantic notion of Menelik as a flawless hero. In the spirit of myth-busting, it's crucial to acknowledge that his reign wasn't without its shadows. For one, his campaigns to unify Ethiopia were often ruthless. The expansion involved military confrontations that were far from bloodless. The incorporation of regions like Oromia and parts of the Somali territory didn't exactly come with welcome parades. The reality was, Menelik's Ethiopia was built on both negotiation and subjugation, a duality that formed the backbone of his legacy. Then there's the matter of Menelik's health, which was a bit like a plot twist in a soap opera, unpredictable and dramatic. In 1909, he suffered a stroke that left him incapacitated, a stark reminder that even the greatest leaders are vulnerable to the whims of fate. This health crisis threw the court into a frenzy, with power struggles and succession debates echoing through the halls of the palace. Menelik's nephew, Legionnaires, was named heir, but his youthful inexperience and controversial policies left many questioning the future stability of the realm. Economically, Menelik's reign was a mixed bag of prosperity and pitfalls. Yes, Ethiopia was exporting thousands of tons of coffee and other goods annually, but the infrastructure was still a work in progress. Roads were more like dirt paths, and the railway, while groundbreaking, faced constant challenges from both nature and politics. The grand vision of a modern Ethiopia was still marred by logistical hiccups and regional disparities. Yet, Menelik's true legacy lies in his ability to inspire and unify. The Battle of Adwa was more than a military victory. It was a beacon of hope for colonized nations. It sent shockwaves through Africa and the diaspora, proving that an African nation could stand up to a European power and win. This wasn't just a chapter in Ethiopian history. It was a rallying cry for independence movements across the continent, a testament to the power of resilience and strategic brilliance. Menelik's humor, too, was a legacy in its own right. His witty remarks were more than just comic relief. They were a tool of diplomacy, a way to disarm opponents and allies alike. When asked about the secret to his success, Menelik reportedly quipped, "A good leader knows when to smile and when to strike." This blend of charm and cunning was his hallmark, allowing him to navigate the treacherous waters of politics with a grace that left many in awe. So, what would Menelik think of his legendary status today? Perhaps he'd chuckle at the romanticized narratives, knowing full well the gritty realities behind them. He might appreciate the admiration, but would likely remind us that history is never black and white. It's a tapestry of triumphs and tribulations, woven together with threads of both glory and grit. As the curtain falls on Menelik Roman II's story, his legacy remains a complex mosaic of innovation, resilience, and power. He was not just a king, but a modernizer, a strategist, and a man who dared to dream of a sovereign Ethiopia in a world that sought to divide and conquer. In a realm where myths and realities intertwine, Menelik's story is a reminder of the power of vision and the enduring spirit of a nation that refused to be silenced. His legacy is not just etched in stone, but lives on in the heart of every Ethiopian who carries the torch of independence and innovation into the future. And as we bid adieu to Emperor Menelik Roman II, we do so with the understanding that his life was not just a series of events, but a testament to the enduring power of leadership and the human spirit's capacity to overcome adversity. You're jolted awake, not by an alarm clock, but by the cacophony of the 16th century Istanbul streets. A sensory explosion of merchants shouting, donkeys braying, and an unholy alliance of exotic spices tickling your nostrils. Welcome to a time when the air itself was a commercial for the Ottoman Empire's gastronomic wonderland. Forget waking up to the smell of coffee. Here, you rise to a heady mix of cumin, saffron, and the faint but promising aroma of roasted lamb. It's a market day, and you're about to dive headfirst into the bustling heart of one of history's most extravagant feasting cultures. As you step into the vibrant labyrinthine streets, prepare yourself for a masterclass in medieval economics. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just a sprawling patch of land. It was the Amazon prime of its day, a colossal trade hub connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. And what powered this feast-driven economy? Spices. A sprinkle of cinnamon wasn't just for grandma's pie. It was the Bitcoin of the 16th century, a status symbol and economic powerhouse, all rolled into one tiny, fragrant package. Navigating the market, it's impossible to ignore the sheer diversity of goods, a testament to the empire's reach. Spices from India, silk from China, and coffee from Yemen crowd the stalls. You might even catch a glimpse of a merchant from Persia, haggling over a pile of saffron worth its weight in gold. Literally. Saffron was more expensive than gold, and if you think $5 for a latte is steep, try bartering with something that costs a king's ransom for a pinch. The logistics behind these vibrant markets are as intricate as the patterns on a Persian rug. Feeding an empire is no small feat, and the Ottomans were nothing if not meticulous. Think of them as the original logistics wizards, a medieval Amazon warehouse, but with more camels and fewer drones. The intricate trade networks snaked their way across continents, bringing goods from as far afield as the Indian subcontinent and the heart of Africa. It wasn't just about acquiring spices and silks. It was about displaying the empire's might through its culinary prowess. You might be tempted to romanticize this vibrant marketplace, imagining it as a quaint bazaar full of friendly merchants and delightful exchanges. But let's be real. This was a cutthroat world where deals were made and unmade with the flick of a wrist. The bustling streets might look picturesque, but beneath the colorful stalls, there was a fierce economic engine driving the empire's opulence. The reality was, trade was as much about power as it was about peppercorns. If you wanted the best goods, you had to navigate a landscape as treacherous as it was aromatic. Amidst the chaos, you can't ignore how every exotic spice, every shimmering silk, is a piece of the empire's grand puzzle. Each transaction, each negotiation, adds another layer to the Ottoman feast, a reflection of its vast reach and complex trade networks. You might spot a scribe tallying accounts in a ledger, his quill scratching out numbers that represent fortunes. It's a reminder that behind every succulent dish was an economic strategy, a game of chess played by sultans and merchants alike, each move calculated to maintain the empire's gastronomic supremacy. And let's not forget the star player in this culinary game, cinnamon. This unassuming bark was more than a flavor enhancer. It was a statement. Imported from Sri Lanka and India, cinnamon was a hot commodity, its value soaring to dizzying heights. It was like having your stock portfolio in spice form, with the added bonus of making your dessert taste divine. But obtaining it was no walk in the Sultan's garden. The journey from Ceylon to the Ottoman kitchens was fraught with pirates, perilous seas, and the ever-looming question of whether your cargo would arrive intact or end up seasoning the ocean floor. As you navigate this vibrant tapestry of trade, it's clear that the bustling markets are not just about buying and selling goods, they're about asserting dominance. The Ottomans knew that a feast was not just a meal, but a showcase of power and influence. The spices and goods flooding the markets were the foundation of the empire's social and political fabric. Every dish served at a lavish banquet was a statement, a declaration of the empire's reach, and its ability to gather the world's finest ingredients under one roof. So, as you wander through the bustling streets, dodging merchants, and sampling the occasional morsel from a friendly vendor, remember, you're not just observing a market. You're witnessing the heartbeat of an empire, a complex dance of economics and culture that fueled the Ottoman feasts. It's a world where cinnamon was king, spices were currency, and every meal told a story of conquest and connection. As the sun climbs higher, casting its golden light over the city, you can't help but wonder what culinary wonders the day will bring. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire, where every bite is a taste of history. And speaking of culinary wonders, let's shuffle away from the bustling bazaar and waltz right into the grand kitchens of Topkapi Palace, where the real magic and occasional mayhem happens. If you think your Thanksgiving dinner requires Herculean effort, hold onto your ladles. You're about to enter a world where preparing a meal was like planning a military campaign, complete with strategy, logistics, and a whole lot of roasting. Imagine this. The kitchen complex at Topkapi was a sprawling culinary metropolis stretching over 5,000 square meters, the size of a small village. It wasn't just a kitchen, it was the beating heart of the palace, where over 800 kitchen staff worked like clockwork. Well, more like a clock with the occasional missing cog, given the chaos of feeding thousands of people every day. You had cooks, bakers, butchers, and a motley crew of assistants, all orchestrated by the head chef, the Ottoman equivalent of Gordon Ramsay, minus the reality TV show, and with considerably more job insecurity. Let's talk numbers. A typical feast could require up to 200 sheep, 100 lambs, and 10,000 loaves of bread. That's not a typo. 10,000 loaves. It's enough carbs to make your keto diet weep, and we're just getting started. Add to that a metric ton of rice, gallons of yogurt, and a small mountain of fruits and vegetables. This was not a dinner party. It was an edible empire-building exercise. But why so much food? Well, in the Ottoman Empire, a feast wasn't just about filling bellies. It was a display of wealth, power, and let's face it, a bit of culinary one-upmanship. You weren't just feeding guests, you were feeding egos. The more extravagant the spread, the more it spoke to the Sultan's magnificence and the empire's reach. Think of it as the 16th century version of Instagram, where your likes came in the form of nods, praises, and the occasional diplomatic alliance. Now, these culinary rock stars had to navigate the Sultan's notoriously fickle palate. One day he might crave a particular dish, and the next, he'd banish it from the menu like it was last season's fashion faux pas. You'd think these chefs were whipping up spells rather than stews, given how much their fortunes depended on the Sultan's whims. A dish that wowed yesterday could be your ticket to a pink slip today. Talk about job security that's shakier than a soufflé in an earthquake. Speaking of soufflés, dessert was no afterthought. The Ottomans had a sweet tooth to rival Willy Wonka. Confections made from honey, nuts, and spices were as much a part of the feast as the meat and bread. And let's not forget baklava, a layered pastry so decadent it made its way from the palace kitchens to become a symbol of Ottoman culinary prowess. If you've ever wondered how many layers of pastry it takes to impress a sultan, the answer is as many as humanly possible, preferably dripping with syrup and sprinkled with crushed pistachios. But before you get too swept away by the romance of it all, let's bust some myths. These feasts weren't always the harmonious culinary symphonies we might imagine. Behind the scenes, there was plenty of drama. The kitchens were hot, smoky, and bustling with activity, and not the sanitized, choreographed bustle of today's cooking shows. Picture a flurry of knives, the clash of parts, and the ever-present risk of a kitchen fire turning your culinary masterpiece into a smoke signal. It was less Julia Child and more kitchen gladiator. And then there was the small matter of the Sultan's taste testers. Before any dish graced the Sultan's table, it had to pass the ultimate test, not flavor, but safety. The threat of poisoning was as real as the spices in the pantry. So, these brave souls would sample the dishes first, ensuring the Sultan's meal was fit for consumption. You could say they were the unsung heroes of the dining room, putting their lives on the line for a taste of glory, and survival. Despite the chaos, these kitchens were a crucible of culinary innovation. Spices from the far reaches of the empire blended with local ingredients to create dishes that were as much about politics as they were about palate. The Ottomans didn't just conquer with swords, they conquered with spoons, using food as a tool of diplomacy and domination. The empire's vast reach meant you could find dishes that were a melting pot of influences, from Persian pilafs to Arab sweets, Anatolian kebabs to Balkan stews. And while the myth paints these feasts as endless banquets of indulgence, the reality was a bit more complex. The kitchens were a microcosm of the empire itself, reflecting its diversity, ambition, and occasional chaos. Every dish was a statement, every spice a testament to the empire's reach. The kitchen was where the Ottoman dream was cooked up, one extravagant meal at a time. So, next time you find yourself complaining about the stress of hosting a dinner party, spare a thought for the Ottoman chefs. They didn't just cook, they crafted edible legacies, one feast at a time. As the sun sets on Topkapi Palace, casting a golden glow over the kitchen chimneys, you can almost hear the echoes of culinary triumphs and near disasters. And as the aroma of spices lingers in the cool evening air, you know this is just the beginning of the Ottoman feast, a story that's as rich and layered as the baklava they served. As you watch the sun dip below the minarets of Istanbul, casting long shadows over Topkapi Palace, it's time to crash the Sultan's feast. Metaphorically, of course, because no one wants to be the uninvited guest at a 16th century banquet, especially when the host could have you tossed into a dungeon faster than you can say baklava. So, let's pull up a seat at the table and savor the spectacle from a safe distance, where the only thing at risk is your waistline. Now, if you think your family dinner seating plan is a logistical nightmare, try navigating the Ottoman banquet hierarchy. The Sultan's table was the epicenter of power, where proximity to the Sultan was as much a status symbol as it was a social minefield. Landing a seat too close might earn you the Sultan's ear or his ire. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of being stuck next to the boss at a company dinner, potential career maker or breaker. On the menu tonight, you'll find a smorgasbord of dishes that range from the lavish to the downright peculiar. Picture a parade of roasted lambs, each more succulent than the last, lying beside mountains of fragrant pilaf. But beware, not all dishes were created equal. Some were culinary masterpieces, while others were, let's say, acquired tastes. Ever tried a dish called kibbeh neye? It's essentially steak tardeh with a Middle Eastern twist, raw minced meat spiced with cinnamon and allspice, proving that even in the 16th century, the raw food movement had its enthusiasts. What, you thought you'd escape without trying the royal delicacies? No chance. How about some dalma? Not just any dalma, but vine leaves stuffed with rice, pine nuts, and currants, delicately wrapped like culinary gifts. And then there's the piece de resistance, hunkar bigandi, a dish whose name literally means the Sultan liked it. It's a creamy eggplant puree topped with tender lamb stew, the kind of dish that might just earn you a fleeting smile from the Sultan if he's in a good mood. But we're not done yet. Let's not forget the truly bizarre offerings. Ever heard of stuffed camel? Yep, that's right. If you're imagining a whole camel stuffed with an army of smaller animals, you're not completely off track. It was a dish so extravagant, it was more about the spectacle than the taste. Think of it as the Ottoman take on a turducken, only with considerably larger proportions and a higher risk of indigestion. But it wasn't all about the food. The seating arrangements at these feasts were a delicate dance of power and politics. The Sultan sat at the head of the table, with the viziers and high-ranking officials flanking him like planets orbiting the sun. The closer you were, the more influence you wielded, or at least that was the hope. But sitting too close could also mean being in the line of fire for the Sultan's notorious mood swings. One wrong move or ill-timed comment could be banished faster than a bad soufflé collapses. And let's talk about the elephant in the room, poisoning. Or rather, the elephant not in the room, thanks to those trusty taste testers we met earlier. It was a very real threat, and the Sultan was no stranger to treachery. Feasting at this level was not just a culinary event. It was a high-stakes game of politics and survival. The food might be rich, but the atmosphere was often as tense as a tightrope walk over the Bosphorus. As you watch the courtiers subtly jockey for position, it's clear that every glance, every whisper, is a strategic move in a game where the stakes are as high as the towering spires of the Hagia Sophia. It's a feast, yes, but it's also a battlefield, with each dish a weapon in the arsenal of diplomacy. The Sultan's table is a microcosm of the empire itself, a blend of cultures, tongues, and ambitions, all simmering together in the grand pot that was the Ottoman court. And the entertainment? Oh, it was the icing on the metaphorical cake. Forget Netflix. This was live theater at its finest. Musicians, dancers, and acrobats filled the air with music and movement, their performances as intricate as the arabesques on the palace walls. The Sultan's approval was the ultimate applause, and a single nod could launch a performer into the stratosphere of courtly fame. But don't get too swept up in the romance of it all. While the spectacle dazzles, beneath the surface lies a world as complex as the spices in the dishes. This wasn't just about indulgence. It was about power, politics, and the perpetual dance of influence. for every guest at the table. There were countless others outside the palace walls, toiling to make such opulence possible. The feast was a display of the empire's might, but also a reminder of the socio-economic divide that fueled its grandeur. So, as you metaphorically savor the last bite of exotic delicacies, remember, this was the Ottoman Empire in all its glory, a world where every meal was a statement, where food was not just sustenance, but a symbol. The next time you find yourself at a lavish dinner, consider the layers of history, power, and human ambition that might be simmering beneath the surface. And as the echoes of the feast fade into the night, we know this is far from the end of our Ottoman journey. As the echoes of the feast fade into the night, the entertainment kicks off with a flourish, and suddenly you're thrust into the vibrant world of Ottoman courtly amusements. But hold your horses, or more accurately, your camels, because this isn't your everyday medieval variety show. Oh no, this is the Sultan's personal episode of Ottoman's Got Talent, and the stakes are far higher than just a golden buzzer. First up, the musicians. We're talking about bands that would make any modern orchestra look like a garage band. These guys weren't just playing for applause, they were setting the ambience for high-stakes diplomacy. Imagine a symphony of lutes, ouds, and tambourines, their melodies weaving through the air like the intricate patterns of a Turkish carpet. Each note was meticulously crafted, not just to entertain, but to impress. After all, in the Ottoman court, music was more than art. It was a diplomatic tool, a way to curry favor or soothe frayed political nerves. And let's not overlook the poetry recitals, where poets would wax lyrical about everything from heroic battles to the Sultan's new pair of silk slippers. But don't be fooled by the flowery language. These poets were the spin doctors of their day, crafting verses that could bolster the Sultan's image or subtly undermine a rival's. Their words were weapons, as potent as any sword. It was all part of the courtly chess game, where even a poorly timed stanza could have consequences as dire as a political faux pas. Cue the acrobats, who would twist and contort themselves into positions that defied both gravity and common sense. You might think of them as the court jester's cooler cousins, but their role was no laughing matter. Each somersault and handstand was a display of the Empire's physical prowess, a testament to the strength and agility that mirrored the Empire's own ambitions. It's hard to understate the pressure these performers faced. A misstep could cost more than just their pride. It could cost their head. Literally. Before we get too swept up in the spectacle, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the one not performing tricks. You see, these acts weren't just about keeping the royal guests entertained. They were part of a carefully orchestrated performance of power. Each musician's chord, each poet's verse, and each acrobat's leap was a subtle reminder of the Empire's cultural and political dominance. The court was a stage, and every performer played a role in the grand narrative of Ottoman supremacy. Now, about those myths. It's tempting to romanticize these events as endless parades of opulence and artistry, but let's peel back the velvet curtain for a reality check. Behind the glittering facade was a world where entertainment was as much about survival as it was about spectacle. Performers weren't just vying for applause, they were vying for their livelihoods. The court was a ruthless arena, where the difference between triumph and disaster was as thin as a silk thread. The Sultan's nod was the ultimate currency, a sign of approval that could elevate a performer from obscurity to fame, or from the stage to the gallows. Imagine the pressure of performing a high-wire act where the safety net is as non-existent as a snowstorm in the Sahara. It's no wonder the performers brought their A-game. The stakes were as high as the minarets of Istanbul. But while we're on the subject of stakes, let's not forget the audience. The Sultan's court was a veritable who's who of the empire's elite, each vying for the Sultan's favor like contestants on a reality show, only with more turbans and fewer confessional booths. Every smile, every clap, was a strategic move in the political chess game that was constantly unfolding within the palace walls. As the evening wore on, and the performances reached their crescendo, you might think the court would relax a little, perhaps swap political machinations for a bit of genuine enjoyment. Not so fast. In a world where appearances were everything, even relaxation was a performance. The Sultan and his courtiers were always on stage, their every gesture scrutinized and interpreted by those around them. It was a world where the line between reality and performance was as blurred as an Ottoman mosaic. So, as the final notes of the music fade, and the last acrobat takes a bow. Remember, this was the Ottoman Empire in all its glory and complexity, a place where entertainment was both a tool of the state and a mirror of its ambitions. It's easy to get caught up in the romance of it all, the glittering costumes, the ethereal music, but beneath the surface lay a world of intrigue and power plays, where every performance was as much about survival as it was about spectacle. And as the guests begin to disperse, their minds filled with the evening's entertainments. You know, this is just the intermission in our Ottoman saga. There's more to uncover, more layers to peel back, as we continue our journey through this magnificent empire. Because, much like baklava, the story of the Ottoman feast is rich, layered, and far from over. As the evening's performances fade into whispers, the guests begin to slip away like shadows dissolving into the night. You might think this marks the end of the festivities, but hold your applause. Behind the velvet curtain of the Ottoman feast lies a web of intrigue and influence that makes the night far from over. Welcome to the real after-party, where the dessert isn't just a sweet ending, but the beginning of political maneuvering and secret handshakes. Picture this. Delicate confections of honey and nuts are served alongside whispers of alliance and diplomacy. While you're reaching for a piece of baklava, a vizier might be sealing a pact over a cup of sherbet. The Ottomans knew that the real deals weren't made over the main course. They were sealed in the enticing glow of candlelit desserts, where the stakes were as high as the sugar content. Dessert wasn't just about satisfying a sweet tooth. It was a strategic moment to fortify alliances or subtly sabotage a rival's plans. After all, nothing says, let's be allies, like sharing a plate of syrup-soaked pastries. But let's not sugarcoat the situation. These delicate negotiations were as sticky as the desserts themselves. The Ottoman court was a pressure cooker of ambition and power, where even the smallest gesture could have ramifications that rippled across the empire. A nod from the Sultan during dessert could set the course for a new alliance, while a frown could unravel months of diplomatic maneuvering. It was a world where fortunes were made and lost over a shared bowl of almonds and honey, a reminder that even the sweetest moments carried an undercurrent of political tension. And here's a fun fact to chew on. The economic impact of these feasts was as vast as the empire itself. Hosting such lavish events wasn't just about showing off the Sultan's generosity. It was a veritable economic engine, driving demand for spices, textiles, and all manner of exotic goods. The empire's coffers might have groaned under the weight of such opulence, but the trade networks thrived, their lifeblood fueled by the insatiable appetite for luxury and display. Every dish served at these feasts was a nod to the empire's reach, a culinary map of its vast dominion. But before we get too swept away by the romance of it all, let's debunk the myth of the never-ending banquet. Sure, the image of an eternal feast is tantalizing, but the reality was more stop and go than a Grand Prix. These banquets were sporadic affairs, reserved for special occasions and diplomatic missions, and not the daily indulgence of popular legend. Behind the scenes, the logistics of feeding an empire were daunting, with resources stretched thin and the ever-looming threat of famine or drought a constant specter. Yet, these grand displays of wealth weren't just about excess. They were carefully crafted spectacles of power. The Ottomans understood that perception was as potent a weapon as any cannon, and the feasts were a testament to their might and influence. Each meal was a story told in spices and silk, a narrative of conquest and connection that left an indelible mark on history. It was empire building, one dish at a time, where the flavors of diplomacy were as rich and varied as the empire itself. So, as the night draws to a close and the guests retire to their chambers, reflect on the legacy of these opulent feasts. They were more than just meals. They were a microcosm of the empire's ambitions, a stage where power was both displayed and negotiated. The myth of the eternal banquet may be just that, a myth, but the reality was no less grand. The Ottomans left their mark on history not through endless feasting, but through the strategic use of the table as a tool of statecraft. As you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of the feast linger in your mind. Remember that history is as layered and rich as the baklava you imagined tasting, a tapestry woven from the threads of human ambition and ingenuity. And as the final embers of the feast fade into the night, know that you've savored not just the flavors of the Ottoman Empire, but the stories that made it legendary.